They branded me the weakest hunter in the world on my first morning here, and by noon, they had left me in a ditch to die. The squad captain read my rank to the whole line so the others could laugh at it. Hunter, F rank. I was no hunter. In the life before this one, I held a kitchen, not a blade. Knives, fire, salt, and timing were my whole trade. The captain looked at all of it and decided I was nothing he could use. On that first hunt, they pressed a spear into my hand and pointed me at a creature thrashing in a net. It cried out like a frightened child. My stomach turned over, my knees folded, and I went down face first into the froth. The captain did not even slow his stride. Worthless, he said, loud enough for the hillside to hear it. The squad stepped over my body one by one and kept walking. I was left with ice in my teeth and a single ration in my coat. Here is what none of them bothered to imagine. A cook reads a living body the way a hunter reads a track. I already understood that this whole world ran on hunger, and hunger is the one war I have always known how to win. Something small caught my sleeve and pulled. I turned my head in the snow and found a fairy no taller than my knee, scowling down at me as if I had personally insulted her. She was the squad's prey, the very thing they had sent me to catch. "You are big," she said. "Heavy. Why do you keep falling down?" She did not wait for an answer. She wedged herself under my arm and heaved, and the creature my squad hunted began dragging a grown man out of the ditch. I should have feared her. Instead, I was already counting. She weighed less than my pack, and yet she was lifting all of me. Whatever fed the fairies of this world had stopped feeding them a long time ago. She told me her name on the walk, between insults about my weight. Xiao. She was taking me home, she said, and I pictured some village with a hearth. I had the wrong picture entirely. She moved quickly for something so small, ducking under roots, never once glancing back to see if the hunters had returned. Men with spears did not frighten her anymore. Hunger had already taken everything they could threaten her with. Home was a hollow beneath a vast gray tree, and the tree was dying. Its bark had gone the color of cold ash. Around its roots, a whole town of fairies sat too still, wings folded down, their light guttering low. I counted them without meaning to, the way I always count a room. Dozens at the nearest fire, more behind them in the dark. Children who should have been in the air sat motionless in laps and did not even turn to look at me. The heart tree was their hearth and their heart at once, Xiao told me, and it was going cold. When it died, they died with it. The elders had a plan for that. Their plan was to starve a little slower than the tree did. One old fairy watched me the whole time. May, a voice called her. She did not warn me off. She only narrowed her eyes, the way you watch a stranger who picks a knife up off your own table. I had exactly one ration on me. Hard bread, a strip of dried meat, a twist of salt. 2 days of food for one man. In front of me sat a city, and the numbers between us were an open insult. Then I saw the pot. Black iron, cold, shoved against a root as if no one here remembered what it was for. My hand started moving before I had decided anything. A cook always knows the one place he belongs. There was clean water pooled in the roots, and a handful of wild greens Xiao had been hoarding in secret. I shaved the dried meat paper thin. I halved the salt. I built the smallest fire that would still hold a steady heat. My hands knew the work, even while the rest of me was still lost in this strange forest. Chop, salt, taste, adjust. These motions were the only thing here that still belonged to me, and I was not about to let them go. This is the part I have never been able to explain to anyone. I cooked the way I always cook, with a single thought filling my head and crowding out the rest. Feed this one. Make her stronger. I put all of that into one small bowl. Xiao carried me the worst of them. A fairy child whose light had nearly gone out, too weak to hold her own head upright. The mother would not meet my eyes. She had watched this story before and knew the ending by heart. I gave the child one spoonful, then a second. The third she swallowed on her own. Her wings had hung dull and limp, and now a spark caught along their edges and held there, steady and growing. She sat upright. The entire hollow fell silent at once. She drew her feet under her, swayed, and then lifted off the ground, a hand's width, then higher than my chest. The first child to fly in this forest in longer than anyone could remember. More, the child said. A single word. Her mother made a small broken sound, then snatched the bowl to inspect it, turned it over in her hands, and found nothing but a smear of broth at the bottom. Only soup. Around the fire, other mothers leaned in. One pressed her own starving child closer, half hope and half fear on her face, as if my pot might be a trap that simply had not closed yet. They had their reasons to think so. May took that same bowl, ladled the same broth, and fed the next child with her own hands. The little one swallowed and stayed dim. Same pot, same broth, very nearly the same hands. The one thing that had changed sat by the fire, and it was me. I told myself it was only a good stock. That was far easier to carry than magic. A cook is allowed to own a good stock. Magic only ever earns you a place on somebody's pile of kindling. An elder shouldered through the crowd. tall and gray, his wings held stiff behind him, split through with old cracks. "Vesper," the others murmured, and they made room without being asked. He looked at the flying child, then at me, and nothing in his face softened. "So the F-rank can boil a pot," he said. He chose those words for the whole town to hear. He wanted the human to bow his head. He wanted everyone watching to remember exactly where the bottom of their world was meant to sit. Then he turned it into a wager, and he said it loud so no one could deny it later. "Feed this entire city before the full moon, and you may stay among us. Fail, and you walk back out on your own 2 feet. I ran the sums while he stood there enjoying himself. 20 nights, a city of empty stomachs, 1 sack of flour with maybe 3 bowls left at the bottom of it. By every number I owned, I had lost already." "Agreed," I said. I took his hand and shook it before he had finished savoring the question. The crowd went quiet in a different way now. They had waited for the worthless human to beg. The worthless human had named his stakes instead. Vesper held my grip a beat too long, then let it fall. He walked away, certain he had just purchased my exit from his forest. I was already looking past his shoulder at the pot. He believed he had set a trap. He had handed me a kitchen. When I turned back to my fire, half my prepared greens had vanished. Xiao sat 3 paces off, with both cheeks packed full, staring up at the dying tree as though it had suddenly become the most fascinating thing in the forest. "It is not me," she said, the words muffled around a mouthful she had very obviously just stolen. I looked at her. She looked at the tree. A single leaf drifted down. Neither of us said a word about the green smear on her chin. I did not get angry. A thief at your table is only ever the first person who has decided there will be food again tomorrow. Xiao stole from me because some stubborn part of her had already chosen to stay near the fire. So we struck our bargain without once speaking it aloud. I cook, she steals, and we both pretend the tally comes out even at the end. She did not bolt back into the dark. She curled against the warm iron and stayed, and that was not nothing. She fell asleep mid-chew, one fist still clamped around a stolen root. The smallest, rudest, most stubborn creature in a dying forest had looked at every fire here and picked mine. I draped my coat over her and went back to counting. 7 bowls would form a line by morning. I had flour enough for 3. 20 nights sat on the clock Vesper had started for me. The math said I had lost before breakfast, and the math and I were about to have a very long argument. Bent over that arithmetic, I almost missed the light up on the hill. A man in a guild cloak crouched at the tree line above us, watching our fire burn, sketching something onto a board braced across his knee. He had watched the child fly. He had watched an entire town turn its face toward one human and his pot. He was not writing down a story for himself. He was filing a report. And reports like that climb uphill to people who keep collars and ledgers. I looked at the pot. I looked at 7 empty bowls and a forest full of people the world had already crossed off its accounts. Then I started the next batch. 20 nights. Let them count me out. I had a city to feed. By first light, the line was real. 7 fairies stood a careful distance from my pot, close enough to smell it, still too afraid to close the last gap to a human. 7 mouths, and flour enough for 3. So I did the one thing a cook can do with bad numbers. I said them out loud, in front of the elders, where no one could pretend not to hear. 18 nights to the full moon. 1 pot, a city of hundreds. At this rate, I feed a quarter of you, I told them. The rest die a week apart, the oldest and the smallest first, and you will all stand here and watch it happen in order. The hollow went still. Numbers carry farther than begging ever does. 1 pot has a hard ceiling. I can feed the front of a line, and never the city standing behind it. A field has no such ceiling. Grow food out of dead ground, and you stop depending on a single human and a single fire. Land was the only number that scaled. So I asked Vesper for the one thing that changed the arithmetic. Not food, not a drop of your tree, land, and the right to put a spade in it, and I will grow what 1 pot can never hold. He gave me no answer. He looked at the sacred ground around the heart tree, then at the human asking to break it, and his jaw set hard. It was not agreement. It was not refusal either, and I have learned to work in that gap. Into that gap stepped an elder I had not met. Tern, old, dry-voiced, calm in a way that worried me far more than shouting would have. He did not look at me with hate. He looked at me with memory, and memory is harder to argue with. This is how they always begin, he said to the crowd, never once to me. First the humans feed you. Then, when you are fat enough to be worth the trouble, they milk you for it. Ask the eldest here. Some of us still remember the last time a man brought us a full bowl. It worked on them. 2 fairies near the front edged back from my pot. Then a third went with them. Not because he had frightened them, because he had outlived everyone I had met, and survival buys a trust that 1 hot meal cannot outbid in a single morning. One of them, thin, with a child riding her hip, said it plainly as she retreated. My mother went to a human's fire once. She came home wearing a collar, and then one day she did not come home at all. Then she was gone into the dark. I kept my face still and measured Tern instead. You can outtalk an elder who shouts. Tern did not shout. He believed every word, and a man who has been proven right for 20 years does not bend because one new cook smiles at him. So I did not argue. A debate between two strangers only makes frightened people choose the one they have known longer. I gave Tern a single sentence instead. Bring me your worst case, and let the result do the talking. He smiled at that, because he was certain the result was already his. That night, Xiao found me at the cold end of the pot, turning the problem over. She had her hands cupped tight and her shoulders hunched, and she kept glancing back at the heart tree to be sure no elder was watching her. Only a little, she whispered. One drop. He will not notice. She opened her hands. In them sat a single bead of water from the heart tree itself, trembling and faintly bright, the most forbidden thing in the forest balanced on her palms. I understood what it was the moment I saw it. The fairies drew their whole lives from that tree, and Xiao, who trusted no living thing, had stolen a piece of it and pressed it into my hands without my asking her to. She did not say why. She did not have to. The creature who stole greens off my table had just stolen something sacred to set on it instead. I had an ingredient now that no kitchen on earth could match. I did not yet know what it would cost me. In the morning, I walked back to the elders and raised the stakes myself, out loud, so Tern could not slide away from it later. Bring me your most hopeless one, the fairy you have already buried in your heads, the one drained until there was nothing left worth draining. If I cannot put her back on her feet, I leave. Before the full moon, on my own legs, with no argument and no second wager, I put the only thing I still owned on the table, which was my place in the bet Vesper had set against me. Tern agreed before I had finished the sentence. Agreed, he said, already certain of the ending. He had seen drained fairies before, and none of them had ever come back. He thought he was watching a foolish human dig his own road out of the forest. Vesper said nothing through any of it. He stood at the edge with his arms folded, watching the human stake his own exit on a body that still breathed but had stopped living. Whatever he had expected from me, this clearly was not it. They carried her out on a litter of woven reeds. She never lifted her head. Her light was down to a last red coal, the kind that turns black if the wind so much as shifts. The whole city gathered close to watch me lose. I had bet my survival on a stranger I had never met, on one bowl, in front of an elder who knew I would fail. It was either the smartest thing I had done since I arrived in this world or the last. I lit the fire and got to work. I cooked slower than I ever had, and not for show. The drop of heart tree water went in last, stirred gently through my final strip of meat, because whatever lived in that water deserved to be carried into the dish, not boiled to nothing in a rush. I fed her the way you feed someone who has forgotten how. A touch to the lip, a wait, a second touch. The broth went down and stayed down. For a long stretch, nothing in the hollow moved, and I counted my own heartbeats because hers were too faint to find. Then the coal caught. Her light climbed from a dull red up to a steady gold. Her fingers curled closed around nothing. Her eyes opened and found the branches arching far above her, and for the first time in weeks, they tracked something. She sat up on the litter. A sound moved through the crowd, half a gasp and half something far older than that. She pushed herself upright on legs that had not carried her in weeks, swayed once against the air, and then she stood on her own. Then she left the ground, slowly at first, wobbling. Then, sure of it, she rose into the air above her own litter, the second fairy I had fed, and the second to fly. The whole city tipped its head back at once and watched her climb. She came down in front of me and stared at her own hands, turning them over, checking they were still hers. Then she looked at the empty bowl, then at me. And that one look was all the thanks I would ever need from her. On the outside, I stayed calm, the way a cook stays calm when the dish finally lands. On the inside, I was louder than that entire crowd put together. I had gambled my place in this forest on a coal everyone had written off, and the coal had answered me. May pushed to the front. She did not smile. She watched the flying fairy for a long moment, then turned that same hard stare onto me and held it there. She said nothing at all. But she had stopped watching me like a thief in her house. Tern did not move. The elder who had named my pot a trap an hour before now stood with his mouth open and his whole argument gone, watching a drained fairy circle the very tree she should have died beneath that night. Vesper moved instead. He said not one word. He walked to the edge of the sacred ground, the soil no spade was ever allowed to touch, and he drew a wooden stake from his belt while the whole city held its breath. He drove it into the earth at the root line. One stake, and then he stepped back from it. It marked a plot, a boundary, a place a human was now permitted to dig. The land he had refused me in words, he handed me in silence with a piece of wood. Then he turned and walked off without a backward glance, before anyone could name it surrender. He could simply have said, "Take it." Saying it would have been giving up out loud. The stake was not surrender. The stake was a blueprint. I looked at that lone stake driven into ground no human was ever meant to break, and at the line already reforming behind my pot now that one more impossible thing had happened. The farm existed. The only question left was what I would build on it. I should have slept that night. Instead, I sat up watching the heart tree, because a cook notices the moment something on his stove changes, and something here had quietly changed. Its light sat lower than it had at dusk, not by much, but I had stared at that tree long enough to know its true color, and tonight the color had thinned and gone colder than a few short hours could ever explain. Xiao came and sat down beside me. When I looked from the tree to her cupped hands and back again, she would not meet my eyes. She made a small flattening motion with her palm, pressing down, down. The water heals us. The tree pays the bill. So that was the price. One drop dragged a fairy back from the dark, and the same drop dragged the heart tree a step toward it. I had not bought a cure tonight. I had borrowed against every life in this forest at once. 18 nights had quietly become 17. Somewhere past the hill, a guild report was already moving toward someone who would care a great deal that a human had made a drained fairy fly. I had 2 problems now, and each of them came with its own clock. I saved 1 life tonight, I said, mostly to myself. And I think I just stole time from every other life standing in this forest. The thought settled into my chest and refused to move out of it. Across the clearing, Tern stood alone at the heart tree. He was not watching the fairy still circling overhead. He was watching my fresh stake and the marked plot beside it, and his face was not the face of a man who had lost. It was the face of a man who had just decided the fight was only beginning, and that this time he did not mean to lose it without one. The land was mine, and the land was empty. Bare dirt, marked by a single stake, with nothing in it yet but the promise I had made to fill it. I had won a field and inherited a brand new problem. Seeds, I had none. Hands, I had fewer than that. Every fairy in the city had watched me work a miracle the night before, and not one of them would come within reach of a human spade. A tool in my grip still looked like a hunter's tool to them. The plan I had not told anyone yet was simple and almost insane. Dead ground does not stay dead because it is cursed. It stays dead because nothing has been put back into it. Feed the soil, and the soil feeds you. I just had to feed a forest before the forest could feed me. Land, yes. Seeds, no. Hands, no. And a whole city that flinched from my shovel. As fresh starts went, it was a magnificent one. I rolled my sleeves up anyway, because dirt does not care in the slightest how you feel about it. Zhao appeared to help. Helping, for Zhao, meant drifting past my prep board and relieving it of half my chopped roots while wearing the face of an innocent passerby. I caught her with both cheeks packed full. "It is not me," she said. "I already noticed," I told her. She held my eyes, chewing, daring me to make it into a problem. I went back to digging. We both understood by now that this was simply how the farm would be staffed. A grown man and a thief the size of a loaf breaking sacred ground, while the whole city watched from a safe distance and waited for the tree to strike us both down. No one dug beside us, but no one stopped us either, and I would take that. Then someone quiet arrived. A small fairy, the color of river water, sat down at the edge of my fire without a word, and the air around her did not stir the way it did near the others. Lin, Xiao mouthed at me and went quiet herself. Lin ate. She did not look at me while she did it. She finished the bowl, set it down with great care, stood, and walked back toward the stream without a sound or a single glance behind her. No thanks, no nod, nothing. I knew that silence well. I had spent 15 years cooking for rooms full of people who never once said the word, who paid and left and forgot the cook had a face. A fairy who would not thank me was just another regular. So, I did what I had always done with that kind of guest. I stopped waiting for the thanks. I left a full bowl down by the water where she liked to sit, and I did not stand there watching to see whether she took it. The bowl by the water sat empty the next time I passed it. She had come back and taken it. She still had not looked at me once. But empty bowls are a language I read fluently, and that one told me she would return. Xiao did not understand it. "Why feed the one who never thanks you?" she asked, mouthful of something that had recently been mine. "Because thanks was never the wage," I told her. "The wage is that she comes back. Watch her. She comes back." Tern had been watching all of it, and he had drawn exactly the wrong lesson from the flying fairy. If the power lived in the food, he decided, then the power lived in the recipe, and a recipe could be taken without the man attached to it. "If it is the recipe," he said to the elders, "then we do not need the human at all. We need the formula." He cornered Xiao and pressed her until she gave up everything that went into my pot. The greens, the cuts, the order of every single step. Xiao gave it up under pressure, then looked sick about it, as if she had handed a stranger the key to my house. I shook my head at her once. "Let them take it." Some locks only open in the right hands, and Turn was about to learn that the hard way. I let him have it. There is no faster way to lose an argument than to guard the answer as though it proves you right. So I stood back and let a dozen fairies copy my dish to the last motion, exactly, while Turn supervised with the calm of a man about to win. They used the right roots. They made the right cuts. They moved their hands the way I moved mine. They cooked my meal without me, and then a long row of them sat down to eat the proof that I was nothing they could not replace. Half the city quietly wanted Turn to be right. If the secret was only a recipe, then they owed nothing to a human who might leave or be bought off. I could not blame them for hoping I was nothing special. Some mornings I hoped the very same thing. Nothing happened. They chewed and swallowed and waited for their light to lift, and the light stayed exactly where it was. The broth filled their stomachs and did nothing past that. It was food, and only food. The fairy who had cooked the copy looked down at her own dim hands, then back at her bowl, then up at me across the fire. She had done everything I did. She had felt nothing move inside her. The confusion on her face did more for me than the flight had. Lynn had drifted back while they cooked. She lifted one of the copied bowls, tasted it once, and set it down with the same care she gave to everything. Then she said the first word I had ever heard out of her. Empty. One word, and it landed harder than any speech I could have made. I could have explained it myself. Explaining it would have been a lecture nobody wanted from the human. Empty, from the one fairy who never spoke, was the whole truth in 2 short syllables. Turn stared at the row of useless bowls. So the city is hostage to a single man, he said, and for the first time his calm split at the edge. He had built his entire life on taking what you need and giving nothing back. He had just learned his method did not know how to cook. May chose that exact moment to sit down at my fire. She did not ask permission. She dipped one finger into my pot, tasted it, and made a face as though I had personally insulted her grandmother. "Too little salt," she announced to everyone present. Then she said the thing that stopped me cold. 20 years ago, they salted it right. "You remember it?" I asked. She did not answer the question. She simply began telling me which of these woods I was allowed to drop in a pot, and which would kill a fairy by morning. She walked me along the stream, naming plants as we went. This one for strength, this one for sleep. This one looks like food and empties a fairy out from the inside. So never, ever are you listening to me. She rapped my knuckles hard when I reached for the wrong leaf. She was a brutal teacher. I named a herb. "No," she said. I named another one. "No." "Who taught you to cook?" she demanded, and did not pause to hear that no one in this world had. She threw out nearly everything I knew and handed me names I had never heard in my life. I did not argue with one single no. She remembered a time when this whole forest was fed, and that memory made her the most valuable thing standing on my new farm. For the first time since I arrived, I had a teacher who actually knew the ground beneath my feet. When the work paused, I filled a fresh bowl and carried it over to Turn. I did not say a word. I set it down in front of the elder who had just tried to lift my craft out from under me, and then I stepped back and waited. He looked at it the way you look at an insult left on your doorstep. He did not eat it where the others could see. He did not knock it over either. He picked it up, held it for a moment, and carried it away with him into the dark. He took the bowl. That was either a small surrender, or he was carrying it off to throw out somewhere with a nicer view. I decided to count it as the first one. A man does not carry home a thing he intends to spit on. Behind me, May and Xiao were already fighting about how deep to plant a seed. "Too deep," snapped May. "It is fine," said Xiao, who had never grown anything in her life and had just eaten 2 of the seeds in question. Lin worked through the whole racket without a single word. At midday, I cooked for the crew, not the city, just the 4 of us who had spent the whole morning in the dirt. It was the first meal I set out for hands that had earned it, instead of a line that only ever waited for it. May ate hers fast and complained the entire time that the salt was still wrong. Lin ate hers slowly down by the water and said nothing at all. Xiao ate everyone's seconds. It was loud and rude, and the best service I had run since I arrived in this world. Something had shifted, and I could feel it in the way they sat. A week ago, these were strangers who flinched from my spade. Now they argued over my fire as though it were theirs, which, by that afternoon, it more or less was. The city felt it too. Fairies who had pulled back when Turn called me a trap drifted closer to watch the 4 of us work, doing the slow math of whether a thing that looked this much like a family could really be a cage. One of them, the mother whose child first flew, crossed the line in the dirt and asked if she could carry water. I handed her a bucket. She did not ask permission a second time, and by dusk she was hauling for the whole farm. By dusk, the plot was no longer only bare dirt. It had a cleared channel, a turned bed, and 3 fairies who had decided, without once saying so, that they belonged here now. 2 fed fairies had grown into a handful, and the handful had become a crew. Lynn left before the others did. On her way out, she stopped at my board, set something down on it, and was gone toward the water before I could even turn around. A small stone, smooth and gray, worn perfectly round by years in the stream. From the fairy who would not say thank you, it was the loudest thank you anyone had ever handed me. I put the stone in my pocket. I have taken stranger payments from stranger guests, but never one I valued more on the day it was given. I was not the only one keeping a tally now. I had been counting fed fairies and nights left to the full moon. Someone else had started counting my beds and my workers, and they were writing the numbers down on a board. Then Lynn did one last thing before the dark swallowed her. She crouched at the stream and tapped the still water and waited for me to look at what the surface was holding. A reflection from the far bank, steady and very sharp. On the path above the farm, a man in a guild cloak knelt with a board across his knee, drawing a careful map of my plot. The cleared channel, the turned beds, the count of us. He was not passing through the forest. He was taking inventory of everything I had just built. 8 mornings in, the dead ground finally answered me. Thin green shoots stood in the turned beds, the first living things to grow from this soil in longer than anyone here had been alive. I crouched down and just looked at them. I am no mage, and no warrior either. The captain who branded me had that much right. What I had done instead was take ground that had refused life for 20 years and pull green up out of it. If that is not magic, it is the only kind I will ever own. For one whole morning, I did not think about the wager, or the flower, or the clock. I knelt in the dirt grinning at a row of sprouts like a fool. It was the first hour of peace I had bought myself since I landed in this world. Xiao landed on my shoulder to inspect the shoots and pronounce them edible, which from her was the highest praise a plant could earn. A grounded child reached out and touched one green stem, and the small laugh she made stopped me cold where I knelt. The second morning, the sprouts were gone. Something had walked the beds end to end in the dark, crushing every row flat into the mud, and it had taken its time to be thorough about the work. So much for peace. One night with my mind off food, and the forest reminded me that nothing here ever comes free. I knelt in the ruined bed and started reading the ground, because the ground always tells you who. I followed the prints to the tree line and lost them among the roots. Whoever this was knew the farm well enough to vanish into it. That ruled out a guild stranger. The person crushing my fields slept somewhere inside this very city. The whole farm assumed turn. He had called my pot a trap, lost in front of everyone, and carried his grudge home in a borrowed bowl. An angry elder stamping my seedlings flat fit the story everybody already wanted to tell. May killed that story with one look at the prince. Turn does not walk like this, she said. These tracks are too light. An earth fairy leaves a heavier mark. The roots part for us. Whoever did this fought the ground the whole way across. She was right, and I should have caught it first. The prints were small and quick and uneven, the steps of someone who hated every second of the task and forced themselves through it. Not an elder making a point, someone younger and far more afraid. So now I had a tidy little collection. 2 enemies outside the forest who wanted me gone, and one inside it I could not yet name, walking my beds at night. Wonderful. The farm was thriving in every way except the single one that mattered. Zhao wanted to mount a guard on the beds every night with a sharp stick. We do not need a guard, I told her. We need to know who and why. A saboteur with a reason is just a worker nobody has convinced yet. She did not look convinced either. May watched me work it out, and something in her face shifted. She had started to say a name and stopped herself short. Ask me by the fire tonight, she said. Not here. Some things this forest will only say in the dark. That night I sat with May away from the others, and I asked the question she had been dodging since the salt. Who fed this forest 20 years ago? She stayed quiet a long while before she decided I had earned the answer. There was a provider once, she said. A man at a pot, the way you are. When he stood at his fire, the heart tree burned gold, and the whole forest bloomed, and no fairy in it ever went to sleep hungry. I tried to picture it. This gray, starving hollow, loud with wings instead of silence. The tree above it burning bright, children too well fed to hold still. It was the exact thing I was building. It had already existed once, and it had ended in a grave nobody would point to. He left, I asked. May looked into the fire and did not look away from it. Not all the dead died of hunger, she said. That was the whole of it. She would give me nothing more, and the way she would not told me far more than the words had. So there had been a man who did what I do, in this same forest, at a pot like mine, and the forest had buried him and rewritten the ending. The clock I was racing suddenly had a second hand I had not noticed. Whatever killed him had not gone anywhere. We caught the saboteur the next night. May simply waited in the dark by the beds while I made a show of sleeping, and when the small, quick feet came back to finish the ruined rows, she lit a torch. It was a young fairy named Pei, She did not run when the light caught her. She stood in the wrecked bed with mud to her knees and dared me to do something about it, her chin up, her fists shaking at her sides. I waited for an apology that was clearly never coming. Instead, she put the whole thing in my face, loud enough for the farm to hear. "You think you are saving us. You are not. You are fattening us up. The weak get left alone," she said. "The strong get noticed. You make this city strong. You make it worth taking. And when the takers come back, it will be because you rang the dinner bell. You are not a provider. You are bait." It was not the raving of a frightened child. It was a clean argument with a real wound underneath it. The guild had drained her mother on a milking line until nothing was left, and she had watched it happen because her mother was strong enough to be worth draining. The worst of it was that half the farm went quiet because half the farm had buried someone the very same way and had been thinking the very same thing in private. Pei had not split the city. She had only said out loud the fear that was already sitting in it. An old fairy beside me said it without any heat, which made it land harder. "She is right," he murmured. "We were safest when we were too poor to be worth the trip." Then he looked at his own grandchild, bright and fed for the first time in years, and could not decide which fear to hold. I did not defend myself. There was nothing to argue, because she was not entirely wrong, and a man who argues with a true thing only ends up looking like a liar. So I did the one thing she could never have expected from someone she had just wronged. The next morning, I set out a bowl with her name on it. A full one, the best of the pot, placed at the head of the beds she had trampled flat. "For the one who walks the rows at night," I told the farm. "She eats first." Xiao hated it. "You feed the one who wrecks the beds," she hissed, "while the rest of us dig." "I know," I told her. "Feed her especially. She is the only one saying the true thing out loud, and the truth always gets a bowl at my fire." Xiao stole a carrot in protest and stayed. Mei watched me set it down, and something in her cracked open. In the kitchen trade, we used to say a difficult customer is only a hungry person nobody fed in time. Pei had been starving for years in a way one bowl would never fix. I meant to keep setting it out anyway. Then Mei said the thing the torchlight had shaken loose in her. "The provider before you was not killed by the forest," she said. "He was killed by the ones who came to guard him." She let the word guard sit there until I understood it. Guards wear guild cloaks. I asked Mei the question that old Mark had put in my head. If his own guards killed him, why guard him at all? "A fed forest is worth more alive than dead," she said, "right up to the day it stops needing you. Then guarding turns into something else." She would not say what. That was the second layer, and it was worse than the first. The last man to hold my job had been protected to death by the very people now sketching maps of my farm. I set Pei's bowl out again the next morning, and the morning after that one too. For 3 mornings the bowl sat at the head of the beds, and for 3 mornings Pei did not come. The sprouts came back instead, a second planting, greener than the first, because Mei now ran the soil, and Mei did not miss a thing. On the 4th morning, Pei was there before me. She did not touch the bowl. She said nothing at all, no apology and no surrender. She lifted a spade off the pile and started turning over the same bed she had wrecked. I let her work and did not turn it into a moment. Some people come back to the table loud, and some come back with their heads down and a spade in their hands. The second kind mean it. I only made sure there was a place left in the row for her. By midday, Pei had turned more soil than Xiao managed in a week, working with the flat fury of someone who needed her hands too busy to let her think. Mei set a basket of seed down beside her without a word. Pei took it. The crew had quietly become 4. Turn saw all of it from the tree line. He had built his entire case on fear, and his fiercest believer had just walked onto the human's farm and started to dig for it. For the first time since I met him, the elder opened his mouth and found nothing waiting in it. I had braced for speeches. I had a dozen arguments ready for the day Pei came around, and in the end, I needed none of them. It took a breakfast she would not touch, and a spade nobody handed her. I left the crew to the beds and walked up to the heart tree. I had only meant to check how far the dewdate had dimmed it. Instead, I found something burned into the old bark at the height of my own shoulder, and the sight of it pulled me up short. It was a cook's mark, a simple seared brand of a pot above a flame, old and grown over at the edges, the kind of sign a man leaves to say, "This fire was mine." The provider before me had stood right here and marked the tree as his own. Beneath it, the wood told the rest. A second cut sat just under the brand, pale and clean and raw, the fresh stroke of a blade through bark that had not had a single day to weather. Someone had stood at this tree very recently and answered the old mark with steel. The guild had not only watched my farm from a hill and a path, they had walked into the heart of the city, to the tree itself, and left their reply carved on it in the dark. They knew the way in. They had always known the way in. I thought of the man on the path with his careful map, and the watcher on the hill before him, and now this fresh cut on the tree itself. 3 sightings, each one closer than the last. They were not deciding whether to come. They were measuring how much there would be to take. My clock changed its meaning while I stood there. I had thought I was racing 20 nights to feed a city. Now I understood I was racing something far older. The question was no longer how fast I could fill the bowls. It was how long before the ones who killed the last provider came back for me. The next threat did not arrive with an army. It came alone, walking out of the morning fog at the tree line, one man in a guild cloak with an official tag swinging at his collar. He did not hurry. He did not need to. The fairies scattered, and then they did something brand new. The children did not flee into the dark. They ran and hid behind me, a human, gripping my legs in the hem of my coat. A month ago, I was the monster at the gate. Now I was the wall they hid behind. Vesper watched from the roots with his arms crossed, waiting to see whether the human he had bet against would fold the instant a real hunter arrived. Turn watched too, and for once the two old rivals were plainly hoping for the very same thing. "Hunter, third-rank Corvin," he said, flat as a line in a ledger. "Reconnaissance. This farm stands in violation of guild charter." He recited it the way a man reads a sentence he has read 100 times and long since stopped hearing. He did not shout. That was the part that told me what I was dealing with. The loud ones want something from you in the moment. The quiet ones already have their orders and only came to confirm the count. Corvin was here to count. He came alone, which meant one of two things. Either the guild was very sure of itself, or this was only the scout sent ahead. Both answers pointed me the same way. You do not win a man like this with a spear. You win him at a table. So I looked at him the way I look at everyone, which is to say, like a cook. And what I found under the cloak and the cold voice was not a soldier at all. It was a starving man doing his level best to stand like one. His cheeks had gone hollow beneath the regulation calm. His hands carried a fine trimmer he kept tucked against his belt, and when a gust pulled the steam off my pot across the clearing, his throat moved. He swallowed, and you could see he hated himself for it. I knew that swallow. I had felt it myself, face down in a ditch on my first morning here, one ration in my coat and no promise of a second. The guild had done to this boy the exact thing the captain had tried to do to me. The guild starved its own. I understood the whole of it in that one swallow. They kept their low-rank hunters hungry on purpose, because a hungry man is a disciplined man, and a disciplined man does not ask why his orders no longer make any sense. It changed the shape of the entire war for me. I had thought the guild's victims all wore wings. Here stood one in their own uniform, drained the same way Pei's mother was drained, only slower, and trained to call it loyalty. A hungry man is angrier than any fed villain and far more dangerous because he has nothing left to protect except the rules that are starving him. I had exactly one tool for a man like that, and it was not the spade. Corvin chose that moment to move. He stepped toward the nearest fairy, a small one too slow to get behind me with the rest, and his hand came up to take her by the wing. The whole clearing stopped breathing. This was the moment a hunter does the one thing a hunter knows how to do. Every fairy on the farm waited for me to grab a blade. It was the obvious move. It was also the move that ended with a dead hunter, a furious guild, and a reason written on paper to burn the whole forest to ash. I was not about to hand them that gift. I gave it 3 full seconds of heroic pause. Then I did the single most dangerous thing in my arsenal. I lifted a bowl, filled it, and set it on the ground between him and the fairy. "Eat first," I told him. "You can argue with me on a full stomach." His hand stopped in the air. He looked at the bowl, then at me, and the contempt on his face flickered out for a second. The charter said seize the asset. The charter said nothing about a hot bowl of stew sitting in front of a man who had not eaten properly in weeks. He ate it before his mind could overrule the choice. He dropped to one knee, and he ate fast, the way you eat when some animal part of you is certain the food will be snatched away. For about 4 spoonfuls, the hunter was simply gone. What was left kneeling there was a boy, younger than the cloak made him look, jaw working, eyes half shut, wearing the same naked relief I had seen on a flying child. My pot does not care what uniform you put on over your hunger. Hunger is only ever hunger. The little fairy he had reached for crept back to my side while he ate, watching the hunter who had nearly taken her now kneeling in the mud over a bowl. She did not understand any of it. She only understood that the hand had stopped reaching. Then his brain caught up with his stomach. He realized he was down on one knee in the dirt, eating from the hand of the man he came to arrest, in front of the very creatures he came to seize. He shoved the bowl away so hard the rim cracked. He stood, wiped his mouth on the back of his glove, and backed toward the tree line without taking a single fairy with him. And that was a win. It should have felt clean. It did not, because of what was happening behind me. Several fairies had stepped back, not from Corvin, from me. They had watched me kneel in front of one of their hunters and feed him with my own 2 hands, and to them the picture was simple and sickening. The human feeds the men who milk us. One of them said it to my face, an older fairy with her grandchild balanced on her hip. "We hid behind you," she said, "and you fed the hand that empties us." Then, she carried the child away from my fire, and the empty space where they had stood felt very loud. Sio did not yell at me. That was somehow worse than if she had. She simply stayed where she was, a few paces too far off, watching me with a question on her face she would not ask aloud. The thief who lived at my fire did not come to my side. I had made my second real mistake in this forest, and I knew it the instant I saw her stand still. I had looked at Corvin and seen a hungry man. I should have looked at my own people first and seen their terror of his coat. I did not give a speech about it. Speeches are for men who want to be forgiven faster than they have earned. I made a quiet decision to set things right with the fairies before I worried about the guild again, and I let Xiao keep her distance for now. Corvin reached the tree line and should have just vanished into it. Instead, he stopped, his back to me, the way a man stops when he has decided to break a rule he is going to regret. Then he told me the truth I was never meant to have. They do not want you dead, he said. That is the part you have wrong. Dead is what they do to a forest that fights them. They have a better plan for one that cooks. They want you to fatten these little things up nice and strong. A fed fairy gives 10 times what a starved one gives, he said, and a fed fairy can be milked for years instead of weeks. You are not the enemy they came to crush. You are the most valuable barn the guild has stumbled onto in 20 years. You are a farm, he said. Then he was gone into the fog before I could answer, and the sentence stood there in the clearing where every fairy had heard it land. He had broken his own protocol to warn me, and I could not see why a starving guild hunter would do that for a man he had only just met. I filed the question away. A scout who hands you the enemy's whole plan on his way out is either a fool or a friend I had not made yet. I thought of the cook's mark burned into the bark and the fresh blade cut beneath it. This was how it began for the man before me too. First they name you valuable, then they protect you. Then, once you are full and strong in theirs, they fit the collar. The plan was worse than an execution because it was aimed straight at my one wound. Back home, my craft had been taken for free and thrown away when they were done. Here, they meant to take it forever and enslave everyone I fed to keep the supply flowing. That evening, I sat alone at the dead hearth, not cooking, just turning the word farm over and over until it lost its shape. The pot was cold. I had not bothered to light it. For once, I had no appetite to feed anyone, least of all myself. Xiao came out of the dark and sat down beside me. She said nothing about the morning. She set a bowl into my hands, one she had filled herself from the cold leftovers, and pushed it against my chest until I took hold of it. It is not because I feel sorry for you, she said quickly, before I could let it mean too much. You just make a stupid face when you do not eat. It is annoying to look at. Eat it so I do not have to keep seeing the face. I ate. The thief who stole from my table every single day had just filled a bowl and handed it back, and she had crossed the clearing to do it when she would not cross it that same morning. With Xiao, that was an entire speech. Mei dropped a blanket over my shoulders as she passed and told me to stop sulking and eat. The city needed me sharper than this. Even Pei, who had hated me a week ago, lingered at the edge of the firelight, as though checking that I was still on my feet. I did not thank Xiao with words. I had learned that much about how trust moves through this forest. I ate the whole bowl while she watched to be sure I did, and somewhere near the bottom, the stupid face apparently left, because she finally shifted closer. For the length of that one bowl, nobody here was a provider or a thief or a hunter's prize. We were two tired people sharing food in the dark. It was the first thing in this world that had felt simple, and it lasted right up until I remembered what was already rolling downhill toward us. Up on the hill, Corvin did not go straight back to make his report. He sat against a stone with the board on his knee and wrote his account of the farm slowly, and twice he stopped, scratched something out, and rewrote it smaller than before. He did not write down the part where he knelt in the dirt and ate. He did not write the warning he had given at the tree line. Whatever Corvin was now, he was no longer a clean instrument of the guild, and a cracked instrument is a dangerous thing to send on an errand. What he did send rolled downhill ahead of him on a fast horse, sealed in wax, and the seal pressed into that wax was not a hunter's mark at all. It belonged to a magistrate, the man who held this entire forest on paper. Kala. 2 words sat beneath the seal in a clean, unhurried hand. Dispatch inspection. No threat, no anger, just an instruction. The kind a man writes when he has already decided the ending and is merely scheduling it onto a calendar. There was a number Kala's clerks would now write beside my name, and it was no longer the bottom rank. 4 fairies stood at full strength because of my pot, and the guild measured a provider by the fairies he could power. On their own ledgers, quietly and without telling me, I had stopped being the weakest hunter alive. I did not feel stronger for it. I felt like a barn whose owner had just been told the harvest would be larger than expected. The scout had been the first. He came alone, on foot, and left with empty hands. The next ones would come with carts, and a paper that swore the forest was already theirs, and a magistrate who never raised his voice because he had never once had to. On the seventh day, there were 3 of them at full strength, in a garden where bare dirt had been. I marked it in my head the way I used to mark a service. Covers done, plates out, keep the line moving. By the 10th day, Tern had stopped speaking against me. He still would not stand in the line. But the morning he walked the beds and corrected how Pei spaced her seed, his war was already over, and the 2 of us both knew it. By the 15th day, 6 fairies stood at full strength where there had been none at all. Their light was the steady gold I had only caught in glimpses before, and it held all the way through the night now instead of guttering out by dark. The farm had crept right up to the edge of the city. The beds Pei once trampled flat now ran in green rows 3 deep, and a line formed at my pot before the sun was properly up, every single morning without anyone calling for it. The children were the proof I cared about most. They were in the air again, chasing each other through the low branches, falling and catching themselves and shrieking, doing the one thing a fed child does that a starving one cannot. They wasted energy. The mother whose child flew on that first night now worked a second pot beside mine, ladling for the queue because one cook could no longer keep pace with a city that had finally remembered how to want food. Her hands had stopped shaking weeks ago. Even the heart tree looked a shade less gray. It was not healed, but the light under its bark had stopped retreating for the first time since I arrived. And a forest learns to read that tree the way I read a flame on a stove. 6, I said to myself, watching the line. Good. Now I only need a few hundred more, and I have 5 nights left to find them. Either the math works, or I have forgotten how to count. And I have never once forgotten how to count. So the numbers were climbing, the tree was steadying, and the city that branded me worthless now lined up at my fire by dawn. I should have known better than to enjoy it. In this forest, the moment things go right is the moment the bill arrives. The bill arrived on a stretcher. 4 fairies carried in one of their oldest, a grandfather of the city, and they set him down beside my pot because there was nowhere else left for them to set him. His grandchildren stood around the stretcher and did not cry, which was somehow worse than crying. They had clearly done this before, stood and waited while an elder faded, and learned the hard way that tears changed nothing about how the guild left them. I knew the look before anyone said a word. The guild had milked this one for years, on and off a line, until there was nothing left in him for plain food to rebuild. I touched a spoon of good broth to his lips and it ran straight back out. His body had forgotten what to do with food. Years on a milking line had stripped even that from him. The simple knack of turning a meal back into strength. There was one thing that would lift him, and I had used it once already. A single drop of water from the heart tree, the same drop that pulled a drained fairy back into the sky on my second night, and dimmed the tree a full step to do it. I knew the cost now in a way I had not the first time. That first drop had been a guess made in the dark. This one would be a choice made with my eyes open, knowing exactly what it pulled out of the tree that fed every fairy here. Let him go, Tern said, and for once he was not being cruel. The tree is all of us. One old man is one old man. Spin the tree on him, and you spend everyone's tomorrow to buy his one more day. Save him, Xiao said, gripping my sleeve, every scrap of comedy gone out of her. She did not have an argument. She had a face, the old fairy's face, and she could not stand and watch it go dark. Mei said nothing at all, and her silence was its own kind of answer. Both of them were right, which is the worst kind of choice a man can be handed. Save the one in front of me and rob the many I could not see. Save the many and let a living man die on my stretcher with the cure in my reach. There is no clean answer to that. So I made the dirty one. I went to the heart tree, drew a single drop, and I did not do it in secret the way Xiao had been forced to. I did it in front of the whole city, in daylight, where every fairy alive could watch the humans spin their tree. I cooked it into the old fairy's broth and fed him the way I had fed the child in the drained one, a touch and a wait and a touch. His light caught. His chest filled out. His eyes opened and found his grandchildren leaning down over him. Then, before anyone could call it a miracle, I told them the price myself. I shortened the life of your tree by a day so this man would live to see tomorrow. I named the exact cost out loud, standing over him, so that no fairy here could pretend it had come free. Judge me for it if you want, I said. Hold a council. Weigh the day I cost you against the man on this stretcher. But hear what I decided first. Nobody dies at my table while I have a way to stop it. That is the one rule I will never trade away. Vesper watched the whole thing from the roots without a word. I had braced for him to seize on it, the human burning their sacred tree in broad daylight, the exact proof he needed to win his wager. He only watched. His silence was not the kind I had braced for. I had just done everything wrong by strategy and everything right by being a person, and I stood there, waiting to see which one the city would choose to punish. A cook learns to wait out a silence. This was the longest one I had ever cooked into. The old fairy answered before the elders could. He caught my wrist with a grip that had no business being that strong, pulled me down, and held on. From the oldest generation in that city, the ones who still remembered the last provider, it was the first thank you I had ever been given. He never said the words aloud. He only held my arm, where the whole city could see, until I understood that this, the grip of a man who should have been dead, was what the tree had bought. And then he let me go. The next morning, the line formed at dawn, the way it always did now. I had my back to it, ladle in hand, working the front of the queue without looking up, because a good cook keeps the line moving and lets the rest of it sort itself out. Then the hollow went quiet in a way a morning line never does. It was not fear. It was a whole city turning to look at the same thing in the same moment, and I turned with them, toward the back of the line. Vesper was standing in it. The elder who had held this forest for 20 years, who had set the wager in open council to drive the worthless human out, was waiting at the end of my queue with an empty bowl held in both of his hands. Nobody had told him to. Nobody would have dared. He had simply walked down from the roots, taken a bowl off the stack like any hungry fairy in the city, and joined the line behind a child and a farmhand to wait for his turn. A child near the front whispered to her mother, loud the way children are loud, asking why the great elder was waiting in the food line like everyone else. Her mother hushed her fast, but the whole city had been asking the very same thing without making a sound. He did not make a speech of it. He did not look at me for permission or for credit. When he reached the front, he held out the bowl, I filled it, and he sat down on the ground among the others and ate what the human had cooked. I could have said something. Part of me wanted to. 20 years of standing over this city, a wager made to break me, and here he sat in the dirt with my stew. But the silence was the thing he had chosen, and I understood it far better than any words. So I let the silence be mine as well. I filled the next bowl, and the next. Across the hollow, Tern watched the elder he had backed for 20 years sit and eat from my pot, and he did not have one word left to spend against it. The whole city had its answer now, and not a soul had needed to say it. The man who judged me first was the one who came first to my line. That is louder than any council, and every fairy who watched it knew exactly what it meant. Tern turned and walked away, not in anger. For the first time since I met him, he walked the way a man walks when the argument he built his life on has just sat down and eaten lunch. He slammed nothing. He simply had nowhere left to stand. By that afternoon, a piece of news reached the farm that had nothing to do with the line or the tree. It came the way news of the guild always came, past fairy to fairy from the edge of the woods. My rank had changed. F rank, they had called me. The weakest hunter alive, branded on my first morning so the whole squad could laugh at it. The guild's own ledgers had quietly crossed it out. I was a D rank now, and I had not lifted a single weapon to earn the climb. The guild rates a provider by the strength of the fairies he keeps. 6 of mine stood at full power, and their math did the rest without bothering to ask me. An F rank who climbed 2 ranks by feeding people. I would have laughed if it were not also a warning, because a number that climbs is a number somebody is watching. The same ledger that promoted me was the ledger that decided I was worth an inspection. The better I did my job, the more valuable the barn became, and barns do not get left alone for long. 6 fairies at full strength, I said to the fire, counting it out where the others could hear. 5 nights to the full moon, F rank to D rank, climbed by cooking. The numbers were good. The clock underneath them was not. I wanted to know what Kala's clerks wrote when a kitchen outranked their hunters, whether they laughed at it, or whether somewhere in a stone office a careful man stopped, read it twice, and reached for a heavier seal. I had a feeling I would learn the answer soon. That night, Xiao did something she had never done before. She came to the fire and sat down beside me, on the same side, her shoulder nearly at my arm, facing the flames the way I faced them instead of watching me from across the pot. She did not steal a thing. There was a tray of cut roots within easy reach, the kind she would normally clear in one pass while denying it to my face, and she left it completely alone. She just sat there beside me. 3 days now without a single theft, I noted. That was either real progress in whatever this was between us, or she had found a softer mark somewhere in the city. With Xiao, you learn not to assume the warmer answer too fast. But she had crossed the clearing for me when the city turned its back, and now she sat on my side of the fire without a reason or a joke to hide behind. From the fairy who wore stealing like armor, sitting still was the loudest thing she could possibly do. The calm lasted until I looked at the tree. I had taken a second drop that morning, and the heart tree was paying for it in front of me, dimmer tonight than a single day's loss should ever have made it. The first drop had cost the tree a slow, even fade. This one ran faster. The light pulled back from the high branches and kept pulling, and the more I took from it, the steeper the loss became. So the 5 nights I kept saying out loud were a lie I was telling myself. The calendar said 5. The tree said fewer than that. Every fairy I saved with a drop dragged the real deadline closer, and I was the hand dragging it. That was the trap of the whole thing, and the guild had probably counted on it. The kinder I was to the tree, the faster I burned the one resource the entire city stood on. Mercy had a price in this forest, and the tree kept the books. Turn came and stood at the tree beside me. Of all people, we did not speak. He looked at the dimming light, then at me, and for once, we were 2 men frightened of the exact same thing. He left without a word, but he had come to stand there, and that counted for something. I sat with it a long time. There was a recipe somewhere in this. I was certain of it. A way to feed the tree instead of bleeding it dry. I did not have it yet. What I had was a stretcher saved, a drop spent, and a clock that lied to my face. Before dawn, Lynn found me at the tree. She did not speak. She led me to the stream, crouched, and tapped the still water the way she had the night she showed me the spy, then waited for me to look at the surface. The water held the cut line that ran toward the city, and on it, this time, there was not one man with a board. There was a column. Cloaked riders, 2 by 2, and behind them a train of wagons rolling slow under empty canvas. Empty wagons. That was the part that turned my stomach over. A scout comes to look and goes home. You only bring carts when you have already decided what you mean to load onto them. And the only cargo on my farm was the fairies I had spent 5 days making strong. This was not an inspection I could talk my way around. Kala had read the number beside my name, and he had not laughed at it. He had sent wagons. The machine I had heard turning since the day on the hill had finally pointed itself at my fire. I woke May 1st, then Vesper. The wagons were maybe a day out, 2 if the road fought them the whole way. Whatever I built in the next 5 nights, I would build it knowing a column was rolling in to load my people onto carts at the end of it. 5 nights on the calendar, fewer than that on the tree, and now a column on the road that did not care about either clock, because it ran on one of its own. I looked at the empty beds where the dawn line would form within the hour, and I started doing the only math that mattered now. The column did not break the gate. It did something worse. It halted at the tree line, and one man walked in ahead of all of it, alone, a leather folio under his arm, and his hands in pale gray gloves. The whole farm had been bracing for this since Lynn showed me the wagons in the water. Now it stood at our edge in daylight, and somehow, daylight made it worse. Vesper moved to the front of the city, and for once he stood close to me. The children who had learned to hide behind me did not even do that. They had read the grown fairies' faces and gone still, the way the whole forest used to be still before I came. One man in gray gloves had undone a month of noise in a breath. "Magistrate Kala," he said, in the tone you use for a name you expect people to already fear. He did not look at the pot, or the line, or the children. He looked at my farm the way a clerk looks at a field he already owns. He found a flat rock, set his folio down, and began laying out papers in neat rows. Deeds. Seals. A survey of the forest dated 20 years back. He did all of it slowly, while the whole city watched a stranger arrange their death on a stone. "The forest has belonged to the guild for 20 years, he said, never once raising his voice. "Your farm is unlicensed cultivation on guild land. The fairies are recorded livestock." He read it out like weather. None of it was a threat. All of it was already true. He came in pale gray gloves, and I noticed that before anything else. A man who means to take your whole life apart shows up in gloves so the work will not dirty his hands. That was not vanity. That was a design choice. Then he made me an offer, and it was far worse than any threat he could have read off a page. He did not want to burn my farm down. He wanted to keep it. More than that, he wanted to keep me. "Stay," he said. "Stay fed, stay protected, stay honored. Keep cooking exactly the way you do. Only cook for the guild. A fed fairy gives 10 times what a starved one gives, and can be drawn on for years. You are not a criminal to us. You are a farmer we have waited a generation to find." He spoke about them as if they could not hear him, which was its own cruelty, because they could. He talked about the fairies as yield, as stock, as a figure in a column, while the mothers among them held their children and listened to their own worth get priced. "You have been hiding in the dirt, playing at rescue," he said. "I am offering to make you rich for the very same work. Feed them well, and the guild will handle the rest." He said handle the rest as though it were a kindness, and to him it genuinely was. I had built my whole life on feeding people who could never pay me back, and he had found the one offer that turned that into a cage. Cook for nothing, and we all starve. Cook for a wage, and I sell everyone I love. He believed there was no third door. He had never met a cook on a deadline. It landed exactly where he aimed it, on the oldest wound I have. Back home, my craft was taken for free and thrown out when they were finished with me. Kala was offering to pay me for it at last. All I had to do was hand him every fairy I fed. And there it was, the thing May could never finish saying about the last provider. This was the shape of it, not a knife in the dark, a contract in good light, a salary, and a slow door closing behind it. The man before me had been offered this same deal. The worst part was that he was offering me everything I had ever wanted at home. A wage, respect, a roof that did not leak. I stood there and had to refuse all of it, and I will admit it was an awkward thing to make myself do. No, I said, out loud, in front of the city and the column both. I feed them so they live, not so they can be milked a little longer. Those are not the same thing, and I think you already know they are not. 100 fairies heard a D-rank cook tell a magistrate no to his face. Nobody had done that here in 20 years. The line behind me went very still, waiting to see what a man like Kala does when a man like me refuses him. Xiao had gone very quiet at my side, not her usual quiet, the dangerous kind, with her small fists closed. She had heard the word owned and understood it in a way the rest of us only guessed at, and she was watching Kala as though she meant to bite him. He did not get angry. That was the moment I understood exactly what I was dealing with. He drew a small book from his coat and wrote something in it, unhurried, the way you note a delivery that arrived a little late. He had expected the no. He had brought a column for it. Say no to a man who shouts, and you have a fight. Say no to a man who writes your no in a notebook, and you have a problem. Because he is not reacting to you, he is collecting you. I had just become a line in Kala's plan, and the plan kept right on moving. 10 days, he said, closing the little book. 10 days to transfer the asset peacefully. After that, the transfer happens regardless, with the column, and lawfully, because the paper was signed before I was ever born into this world. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the tool. The guild keeps a collar, he said, for difficult assets. It binds a fairy's strength to a single master, so the gift flows whether the giver wills it or not. That one, he added, and let the sentence hang there unfinished. Corvin stood in the column the whole time, and at the word collar, his face went to stone. He had heard that unfinished sentence before. He knew how it ended, and the knowing had nailed him in place where he stood. May made a sound behind me when Kala said collar, a small, broken sound. I had heard it from her once before, by the fire. The night she told me that not all the dead died of hunger. She knew that word. She had watched it do its work. He said the fairies were recorded livestock, and he said collar in the very same flat voice, and the sameness of it was the horror. To Kala, there was no line between a ledger entry and a leash. They were both only tools for holding a number where he wanted it. And in that moment, the floor dropped out of everything I thought I understood about my own gift. My cooking works because I mean it, because I want the fairy in front of me to live. A collar does not care what I want. It keeps the giving and strips out the will. Force the gift and it stops being a gift. I did not have the proof yet, but I felt the shape of it settle into me. The one thing that makes my food work is the exact thing a collar destroys. Under that collar, my pot would not heal a soul. It would drain them in my name. 10 days, he repeated, as if I might have missed it. He gathered nothing yet. He simply set the number down in the air and let it sit on the whole city like a stone laid on a chest. Kala let the silence do his next piece of work for him. He did not need to argue. He had set 2 words in front of a starving city, safety and forever, and he let them spread on their own. And the city split right there along the line of its oldest fear. Half of them looked at me as the man who would die on principle and take them all with him. The other half looked at me as the only shield they had left. The crack ran straight down the middle. Pei said it, of all of them. The one who had finally come around to my fire said it without a scrap of cruelty, which only made it cut deeper. Fed and owned is still alive, she said. Starved and free is a grave. At least his way, our children eat. A father near the back asked me quietly whether his daughter would be fed under the guild. I told him the truth, which is that she would be fed and never free, and that the feeding itself would be the chain. He looked down at his hungry girl, and I could not blame him for hesitating. She was not wrong, and that was the whole trap of it. Kala had not split my city with a sword. He had split it with a real choice, and the cruelest part was that the choice only existed because I had made these people worth owning. I did not argue them down. That was the hardest discipline of the entire day, Every part of me wanted to climb on a stump and out-talk the fear, and I had learned by now that you cannot out-talk a fear that has already buried its own children. You can only outlast it. Vesper watched his city crack and said nothing, and the look on his old face was not anger, it was recognition. He had seen this exact fracture once before, a long time ago, and I was beginning to understand that he had stood on the wrong side of it. Kala gathered his papers, squared the edges, and left as politely as he had come, lifting one gloved hand to me at the tree line, like a man confirming an appointment. The column folded back into the trees to wait out his 10 days. That night, I sat at the hearth and did the only thing I know how to do under pressure, which is count. 2 clocks now, one on the moon, one on his paper. I laid them side by side and went looking for the place where they crossed. I did not have the new plan yet. What I had was the cold certainty that the old one would not stretch far enough. You cannot outcook a contract. Somewhere there had to be a way to take the whole board away from him. The night visitor came before I had solved any of it. A shape slipped past the beds and crouched at my fire, and the firelight caught a guild cloak with the rank tag torn clean off the collar. Corvin, out of uniform for the first time. I left things out of my report, he said, before I could ask him anything. Then he told me the rest of Kala's unfinished sentence, the one that had turned him to stone in the column. The collar Kala mentioned was not new. It had a history, and I was standing inside it. They put that collar on the last provider, he said, 20 years ago. They did not kill him outright. They made him cook through it, the gift forced out of him whether he willed it or not, until there was nothing left to force. The man burned out from the inside. That was the whole of it, laid out by a deserter at my fire. They had not murdered the last provider. They had leashed his will and made his own gift do the killing, slowly, with him trapped inside the giving. I had only felt the shape of that truth. Corvin had just put a name to it. This time they will be more careful, he said. Last time, they wrung the provider dry too fast and lost the supply. They learned from it. This time, they will wring you out slowly, so the forest keeps producing while you die by inches inside the column. I gave him a bowl because that is what I do, and because a man who deserts an army to warn his target has earned a hot meal. He ate it slower this time, as though he had decided to actually taste it. Whatever Corvin was now, he was not the guilds anymore. He had walked through the dark to tell me precisely how I was meant to die. In this forest that apparently counts as a kindness, and the strange thing is that it was one. I asked him why he had come. He looked into the fire and would not answer. I asked him again why a guild hunter would burn his whole career to warn the man he was sent to map. He was quiet a long while. Because I ate your stew, he said at last, and after that I could not write it down. That was the entire reason. After he slipped back into the dark, I sat with the 2 clocks until they stopped being 2. 5 nights to the full moon. 10 days on the page. Kala wanted me counting to 10 while the real blow fell on 5. I looked at the heart tree, dimmer tonight than the calendar had any right to make it. The tree did not care about Kala's 10 days. It was keeping its own count, and its count was shorter, and it was the only honest clock I had left. They would cross at one point, and it would be a single night. The night the moon came full, the tree at its weakest, my wager due, and a column of empty wagons already waiting in the trees. Everything Kala had set moving would arrive together, and I finally understood that I had been playing the wrong game from the start. You do not beat a man who owns the law by cooking faster than he can write. The wager was never going to be won at the pot. I had to stop feeding my way out and start dismantling his board. There was a plan in this somewhere, not a bigger pot, a way to make Kala's paper worthless and his collar useless on the one night everything arrived at once. I did not have it yet. But for the first time, I was hunting for the right thing. The morning after the split, the first thing I noticed was the thing that was not there. Xiao's place at the fire was empty. Her bowl sat where I had left it the night before, full, untouched, a skin already forming on the cold broth. Anyone else missing a meal would not have stopped my heart. Xiao was the thief who reached the table before I had finished setting it. She stole the first bite of everything. An empty bowl in front of her place was louder than the whole column at the gate. The fairies had their explanation ready before I asked for one. She ran, they whispered. She took Kala's offer. She gave up on the human and went to the guild while she still could. The word traitor moved through the camp faster than I could put it down. Pei found me staring at the cold bowl. She did not gloat. She of all of them knew what it was to be called a traitor by this city, and she only said, quietly, that maybe Xiao had her reasons. From Pei, that was almost gentle. I went white, and I knew exactly why. This was my wound, walking around in daylight. I feed someone, and then they are gone. It had happened my whole life. It was the one ending I always expected, and here it was, arriving right on schedule. The strategist in me ran the numbers anyway, because that is what I do. 1 fairy against 5 knights in a column. Going after her cost me a day I did not have to spend. I went regardless. Some debts you pay even when the math says you cannot afford them. I left the pot to May and the line to the mother with the second pot, and I went into the deep woods alone. May caught my arm at the tree line before I could go. She did not tell me to stay. She told me where to aim. Ask her about the first one, she said. The provider before you. Zhao is the only soul still living who watched him die. That stopped me cold. Xiao, the thief, the comic relief, the smallest and loudest creature in the city, had been carrying that her whole life and never once let it show. Suddenly, every joke she had ever made looked like a wall with something standing behind it. Go, May said, and shoved me with a hand like a tree root. And do not say anything clever to her. You are good at clever. Clever is the last thing that girl needs from you today. Then she let me go into the trees. I walked deeper than I had ever gone into that forest, past the farthest bed, past the last fire, into the part of the woods even the fairies left alone. The closer I got to wherever she had to be, the more the trees themselves seemed to tell me what I would find. The trees thinned, then stopped, and beyond them lay a clearing where nothing grew at all. Bare gray ground ringed by green, a place the forest had given up on 20 years ago and never once taken back. Nothing had grown here in 20 years, and no one had to tell me. You can read dead ground the way I read everything else, and this ground had not died of drought or frost. Something had burned through it and salted it against ever coming back. Zhao sat in the middle of it, small and still, in the one spot in the whole forest where her kind of life could not reach. She did not turn when I came. She had found the deadest place she could, and she had chosen it on purpose. I did not need the rest spelled out for me. A burned clearing where nothing grows, and the one fairy who would never let anyone close, sitting alone at the center of it. The last provider had died here, and she had come back to the grave. He was the first one who ever fed me, she said, before I could break May's rule and say something clever. She did not turn around. I was small. The guild had drained my whole family and left me to finish dying. He found me, and he cooked, and I got up. So I followed him everywhere, she said. I stole from his table. I sat too close. I made him laugh. I did all the things I do to you now. Then the cloaks came to guard him, and I watched them put a collar on the only person who had ever wanted me alive. I watched it take 3 days, she said. I watched a man cook himself empty because they would not let him stop. By the end, there was nothing of him left to bury. They burned the clearing so nothing would grow where it happened. I was 7 years old. I did not interrupt her once. Every instinct I had wanted to fix it, to say something, to make it smaller. I sat down on the burned ground instead and let a girl who never spoke say the things she had carried for 20 years. And then she turned around, and I understood the whole of her at last. The stealing, the it is not me, the way she wrapped every soft thing in a joke. She had decided, at 7 years old, in this clearing, never to love anything that could be taken from her again. She reached into her shirt and drew out something she had clearly carried a very long time. A square of parchment, burned dark at every edge, gone soft and worn from 20 years against her skin. She held it out, and her hand was shaking. I have had this since the day he died, she said. I took it off the ground before they could burn it with the rest. I have never shown it to anyone. I was not going to show it to you either. That was the fact that reframed everything she had ever done. 20 years, she said again, softer. The parchment had gone soft as cloth from that long against her skin, the ink at the folds nearly worn away. She had kept the last provider's final work pressed over her heart and shown it to no one until now. She had let me believe she was only a thief with a fast mouth. The whole time she had been the keeper of the one thing that could save us all, hidden inside the loudest, least serious creature in the forest. No one ever thinks to look for a treasure in a clown. I left first, she said, and her voice cracked straight down the middle. I left this morning before you could leave me. I got too close to you, and last night that man set a collar on the table, and I knew I was about to watch it happen all over again. I have already sat in one burned clearing, she said. I am not going to sit in another one over you. So I ran, while it was still only going to hurt, instead of waiting until it would end me. That is all I am. That is the whole trick of me. And I finally understood why we struck sparks off each other from the very first day. We were the same wound, facing 2 directions. She was terrified of losing the one who feeds her. I was terrified of being thrown away by the ones I feed. She had not held the recipe back out of spite. She had been keeping it behind one condition. She would not hand it to another provider until she believed he would not die the way the first one had. The recipe and her trust were locked behind the very same door. 1 coin, 2 sides. She ran before she could be left. I cooked harder so I would never be. We had been hurting each other for weeks for the exact same reason, and neither of us had seen it until we were both sitting in the place where it began. I could have argued with her. I could have told her she was wrong to run, that she had hurt the city, hurt me, left at the worst possible hour. All of it was true. None of it was the point. The point was the 7-year-old still sitting in this clearing. So I did not give her a clever answer. May had been right about that. There was no clever thing to say that would not insult what she had carried for 20 years. I just sat down on the dead ground beside her, close, the way she used to sit beside me. I am not going to promise you that I will live, I said. That would be a lie, and you have had enough of those. I have a column at my gate and a collar with my name on it, and I will not stand here and swear that I beat them both. But here is what I can promise, I said. I will feed you for as long as I am able, no conditions on it. Not because you are useful or strong or even because you stay. If you run again tomorrow, the bowl will still be waiting when you come back. That was the thing I never got, at home or anywhere since. A meal with no price on it, a place that stayed yours even after you left it. I could not promise her a future. I could promise her that, and I meant every single word. She broke, not loudly. She pressed the heel of her hand hard against her eyes, and her shoulders shook, and the armor she had worn since she was 7 came off in the deadest place in the whole forest. I did not say anything clever. For once, I simply let her. We walked back together, slowly, because dead ground does not let you hurry across it. She did not take my hand. She walked close enough that her wing brushed my sleeve every few steps, and from Xiao, that was the same as holding on with both fists. If you die, she said into her sleeve along the way, I will eat your entire stock, every last bit of it, out of pure spite. That sounds completely fair, I told her. She laughed, wet and furious, and that was how I knew she was coming home. The city saw us come out of the trees together. The same fairies who had spent the morning calling her a traitor went quiet as she walked back in beside the human she was supposed to have betrayed. She did not look at a single one of them. She did not have to. Only then, back at the fire, did she put the parchment into my hands and fold my fingers shut over it. It was a recipe, his last one. The dish that brings the heart tree back to life, she said. He was making it when they collared him. He died before he could finish it. I read it by the firelight, and it was very nearly all there. Ingredients I half recognized, a method I could almost follow. And then, at the bottom, where the final line should have been, there was nothing. A burned edge and an empty space. He died 1 line short, she said. The last thing. The ingredient that finishes it. He never wrote it down. He never got the chance to. That is why the forest is still dying. He held the cure in his own hand and ran out of time to finish writing it. So there it was, the way to save the whole forest, sitting in my palm, with the single most important part of it burned away and unknown. I was standing exactly where the last provider had died, holding the same problem that killed him, with 5 nights left. 5 nights. A column waiting in the trees, a collar with my name on it, and now a cure I could not finish, left blank by a man who died with the same empty line in front of him. The board had just grown 1 piece harder to read. May and I bent over the burned recipe for most of a day, and most of a day was more than I could spare. The body of it I could read, the method I could almost follow. It was the missing line at the bottom that held the whole thing hostage. She remembered pieces of it, not the words. She had been a child herself when the last provider cooked, but the shape of what he chased. The final thing the dish needs, she said, is a bloom. One that grows only on fed earth. May had been small when the last provider cooked, but she had spent 20 years turning the memory over, and she gave me what she had. A bloom the color of the heart tree's old light. It grew at the roots, in the years the forest was fed. No one had seen one since. I read that back twice and felt the floor tilt. A bloom that grows only on fed earth. And there is no fed earth in this forest, I said. There's not been any for 20 years. May nodded, slow and grim. There's the circle. The heart tree feeds the earth. The fed earth grows the bloom. The bloom wakes the heart tree. Take any one piece away and the whole ring breaks. And the guild had broken it 20 years ago by killing the man who held it turning. And here was the cruelty of it. The bloom only grows where the forest is already healthy. To save a dying forest, the recipe asks you to first have a living one. The cure required the very thing it was meant to create. No wonder a good man died chasing it. A dead tree starves the earth. Starved earth grows nothing. With no bloom, there is nothing to wake the tree. The last provider had spent his final years chasing a ready-grown flower across the whole world, hunting one that bloomed somewhere the ring still turned. He ran out of road. He searched, May said. He searched everywhere for that flower, and the searching killed him as surely as the collar did. He spent the only time he had looking for a thing the forest used to make on its own, for free, every spring. And that was the exact moment I stopped reading the recipe like a victim of it. He searched, I said. He went hunting fed earth somewhere out in the world. It never once occurred to him to make fed earth right here, with his own 2 hands. May stared at me as if I had lost my mind. You want to make fed earth, she said. The thing the heart tree spent 1,000 years learning how to do, by hand, in 5 nights. Yes, I told her. That is exactly what I want to do. The other option is to lose. You cannot find the bloom, I told her. Fine, then we stop looking for it. We grow it. We make one patch of fed earth ourselves, from nothing, by hand. And we grow the flower the forest forgot how to grow. In my old kitchen, we had a word for this. Mise en place. You do not go chasing ingredients in the middle of service. You build everything you will need before the fire is ever lit. Here, the ingredients were not spices. They were fed fairies, and I had 6 of them. Concentrate every fed fairy's strength on one small patch, I said. Pour all of it into a single square of dead ground and force it awake the way the tree used to do for the whole forest. Make fed earth on purpose, then we plant. It would take everything. Every fed fairy pouring their strength into one square of dirt until it woke. It would leave them spent and exposed, weak on the very night the column came. I knew the risk as I said it, and I said it anyway. A slow, safe death is still a death. I did not even have to call them. By the time I looked up from the recipe, Xiao was already standing at the edge of the dead patch with a spade taller than she was, waiting. She did not say a word. She did not steal a thing. She just chose the work. May with her seed baskets. Pei with a spade of her own. The mother who ran the second pot. A month ago they fled from my shovel. Now they were lining up to use it. The whole city read Xiao standing there before I could explain a single thing. One small thief planting her feet in the worst soil in the forest said more than any speech I could have given about what we were all about to do. We worked the patch through the afternoon, and for a few hours it actually went right. The fed fairies poured their strength into the square, foot by foot. The dead gray soil darkened. It began, faintly, to look like ground that might hold a living thing. Then, before dawn, the stream went wrong. I smelled it before I saw it. A sourness in the water that does not belong in any clean spring. The guild had come in the dark and poisoned the only stream that fed the farm. Corvin had warned me the guild would not fight fair, and still I had let myself hope. I followed the sourness upstream and found where they had done it. A split sack of foulness left in the shallows where the current would carry it straight into my beds. Of course he poisoned the stream. Of course he did. I stood in the gray light watching the water I needed turn against me, and I felt almost stupid for the hope. I had let myself believe we might get one clear day. Kala does not hand out clear days. It was a quiet, cowardly, clever piece of work, and it had Kala's hand all over it. No soldiers, no fire, nothing to answer in the daylight. Just poison in the water and a wilting field by morning, and a magistrate who would shrug and call it a poor harvest. The poison worked fast. The new fed earth drank the fouled water and began to die back to gray. The seedbed we had built with the whole city's strength was wilting in front of us before it had grown a single thing. Sabotage, timed perfectly to the clock. Lin stepped forward. The water fairy, the silent one, the one who had said exactly one word all season. She walked to the edge of the fouled stream and looked at it the way I look at a problem when I already know the cost of fixing it. Lin had been the proof of my whole moat, the one who tasted the empty copy and named it. She had been the first to get something back from me, and the first to say nothing about it. Now she was about to be the first to give all of it away again. She could clean it. A water fairy can pull the poison out of a stream and carry it off inside herself. But it would cost her nearly everything, all the strength my pot had spent weeks putting back. She would go straight back to the thin, dim thing she was the day she first sat at my fire. I told her no. I had only just made her strong. I was not going to spend her like a sack of flour to save a flower bed, not her. Not the one who left me a river stone in place of a thank you. I started to say all of it. She stopped me with one word. Family, she said. The second word she had given the whole season, and she spent it on me, on all of us, on the patch of dirt we were trying to wake. Then she walked down into the poisoned water before I could get a hand on her. Xiao screamed at her to come out. May went white. The whole city watched the silent fairy pour herself out to clean a stream for a flower bed, and not one of them could look away. When she said family, she had not meant the word lightly. She had meant every soul standing on that bank. I went in after her and caught her around the waist as her light dropped, the poison pulling up through her and out. By the time the water ran clean again, she could barely stand. I carried her out and fed her from my own hands, the last good thing in the pot, one spoon at a time. And then the thing happened that I had been working toward without daring to ask for it out loud. The city did not wait to be organized. They saw Lin go gray in the water for a patch of dirt, and they put themselves to the work, all of them, at once. Turn was the one that stopped my breath. He came to the patch without a word, knelt in the dirt beside me, the elder who had called my pot a guild trap, and pushed his hands into the soil and began to work it. He did not apologize. He did not say one thing about the weeks he had spent against me. He just worked the bed next to mine with his sleeves shoved up, scowling at the dirt, his hands in the very same ground as mine. That was louder than any apology he could have made. Turn is digging right next to me, I thought, and I almost said something, and then I did not, because him digging mattered a great deal more than me being clever about it. Pay worked the row past him. Vesper hauled water in his thin old arms. Something had changed in the way they moved. A month ago I fed a line of strangers. Tonight, I work shoulder to shoulder with a city that had stopped waiting for me to save it and had started saving itself. That was the one thing Kala could never load into a wagon. Xiao worked beside Lin, propping the spent fairy upright between her trips to the water, the loud one and the silent one, both of them drained, both of them refusing to sit down. I had to look away from that for a moment and pretend it was the smoke in my eyes. Even Vesper, the elder who set the wager to drive me out, hauled water until his old arms shook, and when a child offered to take the bucket from him, he waved her off and kept going. He had 20 years to make up for, and he seemed to know it. Even the children worked. The fairy children who had learned to hide behind me now carried seed in their cupped hands and pressed it into the warming ground, one careful hole at a time. It was not a line of beggars at a pot anymore. It was a city with its hands in one field. We worked straight through the dark, the whole city of us, and as the sky began to gray, I saw something on the patch that had no business being there yet. A thread of green, pushing up out of soil that had been dead an hour before. It came up on the exact spot where, on my first night in this forest, I had fed a starving child one bowl of soup and watched her fly. I had not planned that. I had not even noticed until I was on my knees in front of the sprout. It had chosen the spot itself. May knelt down beside me over it and pressed one old hand over her mouth. She had seen these blooms as a girl, before the guild ever came. She did not say a word. She only looked at the green thread and let 20 years cross her face. One sprout. One small green thread of the bloom the recipe needed, growing on fed earth we had built by hand, with the whole city's strength, on the ground where every bit of this began. I have no explanation for the spot it chose. I only know it was not an accident. I let myself have 10 seconds with it. One sprout, on the right ground, with the right people on their knees around it. Then I stood up, because 10 seconds was all the time the moon was going to give me. I was still rising from my knees when Corvin came crashing through the trees, no longer bothering with stealth, running like a man who had finally picked a side and did not care who watched him do it. He stopped in the middle of the farm, in front of the whole city, tore the guild tag off his collar, and threw it down into the mud at his feet. A guild hunter, ranking himself out of the guild, in the open, where every fairy there could see it. Kala will not wait the 10 days, he said, still breathing hard. It was never 10 days. The capture is set for the full moon, the same night as your wager, the same night the tree is weakest. Both clocks were always the one night. I asked him why. Why throw a guild rank into the mud where everyone could see? He looked at the sprout, and then at the city with its hands still in the dirt, and he said he had spent his whole life serving people who fed no one. He was finished with that. Nobody picked the tag up out of the mud. The city simply made room for him, the way they had made room for Pei with her spade and Turn with his scowl. The guild had sent a hunter to map us, and the map had decided to stay for dinner. So there it was, said out loud at last. The 10 days had been a courtesy that never existed. 5 nights, the wager, the tree at its lowest, the column, the collar, all of it landing together on a single dark night. Everything I had been dreading finally had a date written on it now, and the date was the full moon. I went to sleep that night already counting down to the one that truly mattered. Kala came back the evening before the full moon, and this time he came alone. No column behind him, no soldiers, just one man in gray gloves walking into a city that had every reason to tear him apart, and knowing full well that none of us would dare. The city had braced itself for soldiers. It did not know what to do with a polite man holding a single sheet of paper. The children who had hidden behind me from Corvin now hid from Kala, and the grown fairy stood very still, the way prey holds still. That was the most dangerous thing he had done yet. An army you can stand against. A single unarmed man strolling into your home, certain of his own safety, tells you he has already won somewhere you cannot see. Confidence and provocation, both at once. He smiled the whole time, and the smile never reached anywhere near his eyes. I had learned to read every kind of hunger on a face. Kala had none. He was the one man in this forest I could never feed, because nothing was missing in him except the part that might have stopped him. He set a single sheet of paper on my table, smoothed it flat with one gloved hand, and made his reasonable little offer. "Give me one fairy," he said, voluntarily, a gesture of good faith, and the guild withdraws the column. The forest keeps its farm. One life, freely given, for all the rest. He said it gently, the way you suggest a sensible trade to a man being difficult for no reason. He did not name which fairy. He did not have to. He simply set the choice down and let the city make it for him. Corvin moved to put himself between Kala and the fairies, the deserter facing his old master across my farm. Kala looked at the torn collar where the rank tag used to be and did not change expression by a hair. A lost asset. He had already written Corvin off the ledger, and the poison worked because it was a clever poison. It did not come from Kala. It rose up inside the city in whispers where I could not fight it. If we give in the strongest, they said, the guild gets its prize and leaves the rest of us in peace. The strongest fairy in the city was Xiao. Everyone knew it. She had been drained to nothing as a child and built all the way back, and she burned brighter now than any of them. The math the city was doing led straight to her, and the city knew that it did. A father I had fed for weeks would not meet my eye. He had 3 children and had buried 2, and I watched him work the sum no parent should ever have to work, weighing one bright stranger against the 2 he had left. I watched the eyes turn, not all of them, but enough of them. Frightened parents who had already buried children, doing the cold arithmetic of 1 life against 100, their gaze drifting to the small bright fairy at my side, and then guiltily away. Pei was the one who fought it. The girl who once called me bait stood and said what no one else would. We do not buy a year by selling a sister, she said. We tried being small and quiet for 20 years. It is a grave with extra steps. But fear is louder than Pei, and the whispers did not stop. No one said her name out loud. That was somehow worse than if they had. 100 people quietly deciding which one of us was the acceptable loss, and not one of them brave enough to say it to her face. The silence pointed straight at Xiao, and here's the part of this I am least proud of. Something in me came loose. I looked at the eyes turning toward Xiao, and the only thought left in my head was that they were not going to get her. Not her, not the one who finally stayed. Running was the oldest answer I had. Back home, when they used me up, I left. I did not fight, and I did not stay. I packed what I could carry and started over somewhere else. The wound never made me cruel. It made me a man who leaves, which is its own kind of cruel. I went to my shelter and I packed a bag, fast, hands shaking, the way I do everything when the wound has the reins instead of me. Food, the recipe, a blade, enough to run on. I was going to take Xiao and go, and leave the rest of them to Kala. I told myself a dozen fast lies to make it hold together. I could not save everyone. The recipe was not finished. The city had already half sold her anyway. Better to save the one I could than lose us both. All of it was reasoning, none of it was true. The truth was simpler and uglier than any of that. I was about to do the very thing that had been done to me my whole life. Pick the few I would keep and walk away from the rest. My whole gift was feeding the abandoned, and I was 3 steps from abandoning a city to keep one for myself. I got as far as the edge of the farm with the bag on my shoulder before my legs simply stopped. Not my conscience, my legs. Some part of me knew before my head did that a man who runs from this becomes the captain who left me in a ditch. I could not make my feet take the next step. Xiao saw the bag. She saw all of it, the shaking hands, the blade, the open pack, and she did not say one word to stop me. She watched me with the eyes of someone who had already lived through losing one provider, and she let me choose because she knew the wound far too well to fight it. It was Vesper who stopped me, and he did not do it with an order. He did not pull rank or block the path. He walked into my shelter, sat down heavily on the floor like a man setting down a weight he had carried too long, and he began to talk. I sat down across from him on the floor, the bag still in my hand, and listened to an old man hand me the worst thing he had ever done. He was not telling it to make me feel better. He was telling it because he had seen my bag, and he recognized the road I was already on. 20 years ago, he said, Kala came to me with the same paper. He was younger, so was I. The forest could have peace, he told me. All it would cost was 1 fairy. Hand over the provider and the milking stop, the hunt stop. Everyone else lives. And I stayed silent, Vesper said. I did not agree. I did not refuse. I looked at the ground and said nothing, and silence was the same as yes. They took him that night. They put the collar on him. I told myself I had chosen the many over the one. He burned, Vesper said. It took 3 days, and the peace Kala promised never came. They had the provider, so they had no reason to be gentle anymore. The milkings got worse. The hunts got worse. We bought ourselves 20 years of starving in the dark. I gave up 1 to save everyone, Vesper said, and he looked up at me with 20 years in his face. I saved no one. I only chose who to betray first. Do not do what I did. It does not buy peace. It only teaches them the price they can make you pay. Do not do what I did, he said again, quieter. I spent the one I loved to keep the rest, and I lost the rest anyway, and I have looked at that empty clearing every day since. There is no number where that trade comes out even. I have done the math for 20 years. He had carried that since before I was born into this world, and he set it down on the floor of my shelter at the exact moment I was about to pick it up myself. The old man had come to stop me from earning his own 20 years of regret. The whole city heard it. Vesper did not lower his voice. He confessed the thing that had eaten him for 20 years in the open, where every fairy who had ever wondered why the elder was so hard and so guilty could finally know. The ones old enough to remember the provider wept. The wager he set to drive me out, the line he stood in, the water he hauled with his shaking arms. I understood all of it now. Vesper had spent 2 decades trying to pay back a single silence, and he was not going to let me sign up for the same debt. I put the bag down. I did not do it quietly, hidden in my shelter where it would cost me nothing. I carried it back out to the fire, in front of the whole city in Calaboth, and set it on the ground where everyone could see exactly what I had almost done. I was afraid, I said, out loud. I packed a bag, and I was going to take the one I could not stand to lose and leave the rest of you to him. I almost chose my own pain over all of you. You should know that about me before tonight. But I am not going to do it, I said. Not now, not at the full moon, not for any paper he sets on my table. I give up no one, not the strongest, not the weakest, not a single fairy in this forest. If he wants any of you, he comes through all of us first. Tern, of all of them, spoke first. We do not give him anyone, he said, the elder who spent a month calling me a trap, and the whole city turned to him because Tern had never once argued for hope before. If he was finished selling people to survive, then so was everyone. I had just confessed to a crowd of fairies that I nearly ran out on them in the night. In my old life, that gets you fired and talked about for a year. Here, somehow, it did the opposite. The city did not pull back from me. It closed in. May put her hand on my shoulder. Pei stood at my other side. The mother with the second pot, the saved elder, the children, Lin still gray and weak from the stream, all of them drew in around the fire until the space where one sacrifice might have stood was simply full of people. Zhao reached me first. She had watched me almost run for her sake and watched me choose not to, and she did not say a single word about either one. She just stepped up beside me, took my hand in front of everyone, and held it. From the fairy who armored every soft thing she had, who had flinched from being held since she was 7 years old, it was louder than any vow. She had run first, in the burned clearing. This time she stayed, and she anchored me to the spot with one small hand. I had spent my whole life sure the bowl came with a bill, certain anyone I fed would take what they needed and go. The city pressing in around me, hands on my shoulders, refusing the trade, was the bill never coming due. It was the opposite of everything I knew. Something in me that had been torn open since my first morning in this world, since long before that, started, finally, to close. Not all the way, but the wound that had run my whole life, feed them and be discarded, lost its grip on me with her hand in mine. Lin reached us next, leaning on May, too weak to stand on her own, and standing anyway. She laid her small gray hand over mine and Xiao's. Family, she said, for the 3rd time in a season, and spent another word she did not have to spare. Gala had stood through all of it, and I watched the courtesy drain out of him for the first time. He did not shout. Men like Kala do not shout. The warmth just left his face, all at once, and what sat underneath it was colder than any anger could have been. Then we take by force, he said, flat. No gloves on the words anymore, only on his hands. He opened a small case he had carried in under his arm, lifted out the thing inside, and set it on my table beside his reasonable little paper. The collar, smaller than I had pictured, plain iron, worn smooth in places by other necks. The same tool that took the last provider apart over 3 days. He set it down on my cutting board, in my own kitchen, with the care of a man returning a thing he had only lent out. Corvin watched him set the collar down and went rigid. He had carried this man's orders his whole career. Seeing the real thing up close, the one from the stories, turned the last of the guild in him cold. He stepped nearer to my fire, not the door. Full moon tomorrow, he said. Cook your last supper. Then he gathered his unsigned paper, smoothed his gloves, and walked out of my city as calmly as he had walked into it, leaving the collar behind him on my board. He left the collar on my table, and at first I took it for a warning. Then I understood. It was not a warning at all. It was an invitation. He wanted me looking at it all night, knowing exactly what was coming for the bright fairy holding my hand. Nobody touched the collar after he left. It sat on my board, plain and ugly, and the city gave it a wide berth, and the children would not look at it. I left it exactly where he set it. I wanted everyone to see the real face of the deal we had just refused. So that was the board, finally. All the pieces face up, the full moon tomorrow, a column waiting in the trees, a collar on my cutting board, and a recipe that could save the whole forest, with the one line that mattered most burned away in blank. They did not leave me to cook alone. Xiao set up across the fire with the recipe. Mei named ingredients. Turn ground them. The whole city that Kala had tried to make me sell stayed up with me through the dark, working the one dish that might undo him. I did not sleep. I sat at the fire with the collar on one side of me and the unfinished recipe on the other, the whole city around me, and I looked at the two of them for a long time. The thing that would kill us and the thing that might save us. I still did not have the last line, but for the first time, I was not staring at the blank the way the last provider must have. Alone, collared, out of time. I had a whole city at my back, and one night to find what a dying man could not. It was not enough. It would have to be. One night left, one supper, one missing line. I picked up the recipe, and I picked up my knife, and I did the only thing I have ever known how to do when the math says I have already lost. I started to cook. I cooked all night, and somewhere in the dark, I stopped cooking for the battle and started cooking for the table. When the sky began to gray, I still did not have the revival dish. What I had was enough food to seat the whole city at once, so I did. Some part of me knew the math cold. We could not beat a column, and we could not outrun one either, not with children and elders and Lin too weak to fly. If tomorrow was the end, then tonight was going to be the best meal I could cook for the people I had gathered. I set a longboard down the middle of the farm, under the dying tree, and laid out everything we had. Not rations measured against a siege. All of it. If this was the last supper Kala had promised me, then I was going to make it a real one. A strategist would have spent that final night drawing up a defense, counting spears we did not have, planning a fight we could not win. I am not a strategist. I am a cook, so I built a long table down the middle of the farm and called everyone to it. They came. All of them. The fed and the weak, the fairies and the deserter, the elder who set the wager and the elder who called me a trap. Vesper, Turn, Pei, Mei, Corvin, Lin, Zhao, the mother with the second pot, the children. One table, every soul. A child asked me if we were going to win. I told her the truth, which is that I did not know. Then I gave her the first bowl off the table, because a full stomach is the only honest comfort I have ever had to offer, and she ate it and fell asleep against Mei. There should have been terror at that table. The column was a horn blast away. The collar sat on my board where Kala had left it. Instead, there was warm bread and a low murmur of talk, and somebody's child asleep in the crook of an old fairy's arm. I had spent the whole season trying to feed this city, and only now, the night before I might lose it, did the whole city finally sit down to eat together at the same time. That was the thing I had been missing, and I did not yet understand how much. The food did the talking, the way it always has for me. Things get said over a shared bowl that would never survive being set across a table edge. One by one, around that long board, people finished what they had been carrying all season. Mei sat beside me and watched my hands work a knife, and her eyes filled. "You have his hands," she said. "The last provider. I have known it since the first bowl. I stayed quiet all this time because I was too afraid to love another one and lose him too. That was why she had fought me on every herb, why she had watched me like a thief those first days. She had recognized a dead man in my hands and tried not to care. Now she laid her old hand over mine on the knife and let herself care out loud. Turn ate from a bowl I filled and handed to him directly. He did not say thank you. He did not apologize for the month he spent calling my pot a trap. He chewed, scowled down at the bowl, and grumbled 4 words. "The salt is fine." From Turn, "the salt is fine" was a full surrender. In the language of that stubborn old fairy, it translated to roughly, "You can stay." I did not make him say any more than that. I just filled his bowl again, and he let me, and that was the whole peace treaty. Pei sat across from Corvin, the saboteur and the deserter, the two who had each tried hardest in their own way to stop me, passing a loaf back and forth and arguing about nothing. A season ago, she trampled my first sprouts. Now she was the loudest voice for staying. Vesper sat at the foot of the table, not the head. The elder who once ruled this city had put himself down among the others on purpose. When I filled his bowl, he held my eyes a moment, and I understood he was not asking forgiveness. He had decided to earn it instead. Lin spoke. Not one word this time, a whole sentence. The longest thing she had said all season. Quiet under the talk, so only the near ones heard. "This is the first table I have ever wanted to come back to," she said. Then she went back to her soup. Even Corvin got a bowl from my hand, the guild hunter who walked out of the fog to map us. "I told you once you would eat full before you argued with me," I said. He almost smiled. He had argued himself all the way over to our side of the table. Xiao said nothing at all. She sat beside me, close, shoulder against my arm, and she stole nothing, and that was its own kind of speech. After the burned clearing, after running and coming back, simply sitting there beside me was everything she had, and it was enough. I looked up from filling bowls and saw the whole thing at once. The table, the city eating together, Turn and Vesper at the same board, Pei laughing at something Corvin said, Lynn warm for the first time, May's hand on mine. And all at once, I understood the recipe. I sat down hard when it hit me. May asked if something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. For the first time, everything was right, in a way I could hardly hold. The thing the last provider died hunting alone had been growing at my table all season, every time these people chose to eat as one. The last ingredient is a bloom that grows only on fed earth. I had read that as a problem in farming. Grow the flower, finish the dish. I had it backwards. The bloom was never the point. It was the only way the recipe had to describe a thing it could not name outright. Pet earth is not only soil with food in it. It is ground that is cared for, loved, if you are not too proud to use the word. The bloom only grows where a whole community pours its care into the same patch. The flower was a picture of that, not the cause of it. The last ingredient was never a plant. It was this, the shared intention of a whole city choosing to feed each other at one table. That is the thing my food has always run on, multiplied by everyone here. And it is the one thing the last provider never had. He died alone, collared, forced to give without a single soul giving back. He could finish every line of that recipe but the last, because the last one was not his to write by himself. It needed a table. It needed all of them. He never got the table. And the strange part is that I felt no triumph in it, only a kind of ache. He had been one table short, one night of people choosing each other. That was the whole distance between the provider who burned and the one writing his last line by firelight. I had spent the whole season hunting an ingredient I could chop and drop in a pot. It had been at this table since the first bowl I cooked here. I picked up a charred pen and wrote the last line of a dead man's recipe, and it was not a thing at all. It was us. I read the finished recipe back to myself once, the new last line in my own hand beneath his burned one. It was complete. After 20 years and one dead man, the dish that could bring the heart tree back to life was a thing I could finally make. I just needed the chance to make it. As if the night had decided to give me everything at once, Corvin pushed his bowl aside and laid out the rest. He knew Kalla's plan for the morning, every step of it, because he had been meant to be a part of it. He knew because Kalla had meant to use him for the worst of it. A deserter makes good bait, Corvin said flat. They would have had me offer the first bowl, a familiar face, someone the fairies almost trusted. He looked sick saying it. That was the role he had run from. And he knew the one thing about the collar the guild never says out loud. It does not just snap onto a neck and work. The collar only binds if the fairy takes food from the guild's own hand, herself, willingly, at the first. That first bite is the lock. After that first willing bite, he said, the will no longer matters. They own her. But they cannot force the first one. The whole thing rests on tricking or frightening a fairy into accepting a single meal from the master's hand. That is the only door in. It changes everything, I told the table. We have been bracing for a fight over the fairies. It was never going to be a fight. It was going to be a trick. And a trick only works on someone who does not know it is coming. Now every one of us knows. I almost laughed. Their entire monopoly weapon, the thing that killed the last provider, the thing sitting on my cutting board right now, depended on one act. An act that is very, very easy not to do. Do not take the food. That is the whole defense. So the plan wrote itself, and it was a cook's plan, not a soldier's. We do not fight them, I told the table. We cannot win that, and we are not going to try. We win a different way. We make sure not one fairy in this forest takes a single bite from a guild hand. I gave everyone their part. Stay together, eat only from our own pots, even in the middle of it, even if you are terrified. Watch the children, because the children are who they will tempt first. Trust the table. The table is the whole defense. Not one, I said. Not the hungriest, not the most frightened, not the child they wave a sweet roll at. The collar needs a willing first bite, so the whole city's weapon tomorrow is the simplest one there is. We refuse to eat from the enemy. It asks more of them than a battle would have. A spear lets you do something with your fear. This plan asked them to stand still under threat and simply refuse, again and again, while the guild did its worst to make them flinch. That takes a harder kind of nerve. Kalla built his power on the idea that a hungry thing will always, in the end, take the food. He had never once watched a city with its own full table. I had spent a whole season making sure no fairy here would ever need to take a bite from the wrong hand again. And then, as the first real light came up over the trees, the heart tree answered. Not slowly. The light under its gray bark, the light I had watched retreat for weeks, surged back up the trunk all at once, brighter than the city had seen it in 20 years. The recipe had started working off nothing but the shared meal. One table, one city eating together with intention, and the tree felt it from across the farm and woke. We had not even cooked the final dish yet. The answer alone was enough to make it stir. May wept openly at the sight of it. She had been a girl the last time it burned like that. Tern stood beside her, the man who built his whole survival on keeping the city dim and unnoticed, watching the brightest light in 20 years climb the trunk, and he did not say one word against it. The whole city stood and watched their dying heart tree burn gold in the dawn, and for the first time in 20 years, they were looking at hope they could actually see, standing right in the light of it. Xiao's hand found mine again. Everything was finally in place. And that was the exact moment the horn sounded at the gate. One long, flat note rolling in through the trees. The sound of a column that had waited out its own lie and come precisely on time. The full moon had risen on schedule, and so had Kala. The table went quiet. The light of the tree was still climbing the trunk behind us, beautiful and far too soon. And at the gate, the guild was forming up to take all of it. One shared meal had bought us the answer. Now it was going to cost us the fight to keep it. I looked down the line of them, the family I had cooked into being out of a dying city, and one sack of flour. Whatever Kala brought through that gate, he was not going to find the weak, starving asset he had written on his ledger. He was going to find us. Nobody ran. The whole city set down their bowls and stood up from the long table together and turned to face the gate as one. I picked up the finished recipe in one hand and looked at the collar still lying on my board. I left it there, and we walked out to meet them. Kala came through my gate the way he had walked out of it, unhurried, gloved, a column of armed hunters at his back, and a small iron case under one arm. The full moon hung pale in the morning sky behind him. He had timed it to the minute. He did not draw a weapon. Men like Kala never need to. He unrolled a fresh sheet of paper and began to read the law to my city, in the same mild voice you would use to recite a list of groceries. The fairies are a protected asset of the Hunter Guild, he read. This farm is an act of theft against guild property, and the man who runs it is, by every statute I am sworn to uphold, a poacher. I want it on record that I have now been called a poacher by a man whose entire trade is taking living things out of a forest. I cook soup for the starving, and somehow I am the criminal. Definitions in this world keep surprising me. He let the words sit in the air. Then he lifted the lid of the case and took out the collar, the same plain iron ring that had taken the last provider apart. And he held it up where the whole gathered city could see it clearly. He turned toward Xiao. Of all of them, he chose her, the bright one at my shoulder, the thief who reaches my table first. He raised the collar a few inches in her direction, slowly, so that everyone present understood the threat was real and aimed. Behind him, his column stood in clean ranks, spears grounded, faces still. The law was on his side. The numbers were on his side. By every measure the guild used to weigh a fight, this was already over before it began. Every hand on my farm waited for me to reach for a blade. This is the part of the story where the hero reaches for a blade. I have never once been that man. I kept my hands open and my voice level, and I did the single thing he had not planned for. What I did was call for dinner. I had the great pot wheeled to the gate, still steaming from the long night, and I set my table down in the open ground between my people and his, in full view of every soldier in the line. It is the full moon, I told them all, which in my kitchen means it is supper time. Anyone who is hungry should come and sit down and eat. I looked straight past Kala at his hunters when I said the next part. That means you as well. I do not have an army. I have never had an army, and I was not about to grow one in a morning. What I had was a cauldron that had simmered since midnight, and I meant to find out, in front of everyone, which of us had brought the stronger weapon. The smell reached his line before any argument of mine could. I knew those faces. Hollow cheeks, belts pulled tight, the particular flat stillness of men who are kept hungry on purpose. The guild starves its own for discipline. I had counted on exactly that. A soldier near the front swayed half a step toward the pot before he caught himself. Another swallowed, his throat moving against his will. Kala heard it happen behind him, the small mutiny of empty stomachs, and his jaw set hard for the first time all morning. Ignore the food, he told his line, and he said it quietly, because saying it loudly would have admitted that the food mattered. Then he stopped spending words on me. He turned the collar in his fingers and reached for whatever it is that makes the thing work. The collar only binds one way, and now I knew it cold. It cannot be forced onto a fairy. It locks only if she takes food from a guild hand of her own free will, the first bite freely accepted. Kala still believed that part would be easy. He gave a small nod, and a soldier stepped forward holding out a guild ration, the polished kind they keep for bait, and offered it to Zhao with the open collar waiting in his master's hand just behind his shoulder. This was the whole game, laid bare in one gesture. One bite from that hand, and she belonged to them, the way the last provider's fairies had, the way every one of these stories was supposed to end. The entire morning had been built to walk her to this offered ration. Zhao looked at the ration. Then she looked at the soldier holding it and passed him to the collar, and she understood every part of what it was and what it would cost her. I did not say a word to stop her. This was hers to answer, and she knew it. She turned her back on it. Slowly, so that no one in the clearing could mistake it for fear, the thief who steals the first bite of everything turned away from the easiest meal in the forest and walked the 3 short paces back to me. She held out her hands. I filled a bowl and gave it to her, and she ate from it, where every soldier and every elder could see. The collar in Kala's grip stayed exactly what it was without her. Plain, dead iron. The weakness Corvin had handed us held. She turned from a collar and chose my bowl. People spend whole lives failing to say a thing that simple and that loud. She answered 20 years of being collared and thrown away with one mouthful of soup, and she did it looking the magistrate dead in the eye. For a long moment, nothing in the clearing moved. The air held around that empty collar and that full bowl, his oldest weapon and my plainest one, sitting useless and useful side by side. And then, behind me, I heard the first soft beat of wings. I had not called them. I want to be honest about that, because it is the part that mattered most. I gave no signal and made no speech. The fairies came out of the trees on their own, and all I could do was stand there and let it happen. Lynn came first, gray no longer, her wings catching the new light, too weak to fly a week ago and steady on the air now. She set herself at my right hand without being asked, and faced the calm the way you face a storm you mean to outlast. Then the others. One by one they stepped out of the tree line into the open ground, the ones I had fed back from nothing across a whole long season, until 12 fairies in full strength stood in a slow half circle at my back. 12. In my first week here, I had one starving thief stealing greens off my cutting board. Kala had written in on a ledger that listed this place as a dying asset due for collection. He was looking at 12 fairies in full power who had chosen their own ground, and not one of them had been ordered to it. That was the thing his entire system could not put a price on. He could call her a fairy and own her body. He had no column, no statute, no iron ring for the thing where they simply chose you and stayed. I was, meanwhile, working very hard to look like a man to whom this was all unfolding precisely according to plan. Inside, I was as astonished as Kala. I had hoped a few of them might stand with me. 12 had come out without a single word from me. The half-circle settled and went still, wings down, eyes level, every one of them facing the guild that had spent 20 years counting them as inventory. The dying resource the magistrate came to seize was standing up in full strength to meet him. I watched the certainty drain out of his face. Not all of it, only the part that had been sure this morning would be simple. He looked at the wall of fairies that would not be collected, and then he turned, deliberately, to Vesper. "Vesper," he said, and his voice went warm again, reaching back for an old thread. 20 years ago, when this came to your forest the first time, you were a reasonable elder. You stood aside, and the city lived through it. Be reasonable once more. Step aside. So there it was, finally, with a shape to it. The guilt Vesper had carried all season had a face now. 20 years ago, when the cloaks came for the last provider, the elder who ruled this city had stood aside and said nothing and let it happen. Vesper stepped forward, not aside, forward, until he stood at my shoulder, in front of his whole city, a thin old fairy, putting his own frame between the cook and the column. I had not asked him for that either. Last time I was silent, he said, and he said it loud, so the whole forest would hear the thing he had kept quiet for 20 years. This time I am not going to be silent. I have spent 2 decades regretting where I stood. I am done regretting it. This is our provider, he said. Not the guild's asset, not a poacher, ours. He fed my city after I told him to his face he had until the full moon to fail. If you mean to collar anyone standing here, magistrate, you will go through every one of us first. This was the elder who set the wager to be rid of me, who read out my deadline to the council in my first week and fully expected me to break under the weight of it. He had just put his own body between me and a guild column to keep me on my feet. Kala had carried that old silence here like a held card, certain he could play it twice. Vesper had just torn it up before everyone who once obeyed him. The last lever the magistrate owned over this city was gone, and the change in his eyes said he knew it. He looked down his own column for new ground to stand on, and that was the moment his army began to move. Not forward at my gate, the way he needed them to. Sideways, in ones and twos, toward my table and my pot. The first one to break ranks was young, hollow-cheeked, the exact kind of hungry I had been on my first morning face down in the frost. He looked at the collar in his master's hand, and then at the steaming pot, and he made the only real choice a starving man ever makes. He set his spear against the gatepost, and walked to my table and sat down at it. No one cut him down for it. So, a second soldier followed him, and then a third. and the clean order of Kala's column came apart one empty stomach at a time. The guild had ruled this whole region by keeping bellies empty and the only rations in its own fist. Kala had simply never once stood across from a man with a bigger pot and a longer table than he had threats. Corvin had told me, weeks ago, that to the guild this place was not a rebellion. It was a farm, and they feared what a farm could do. Now I watched that fear arrive in the magistrate's own ranks, his soldiers feeding from the very thing he had ridden out to destroy. My main concern, standing in the middle of the strangest victory of my life, was logistics. His army was sitting down to eat, and I was quietly doing the math on whether I had broth and bowls enough to feed a column on top of a whole city. A good problem. The mother who runs the second pot read my mind and was already ladling. Pei carried bread down the row of seated soldiers as though she had never trampled a single sprout in her life. The deserters' army was becoming, in real time, more of my city. Kala stood at his own gate and watched his power drain into my bowls. There is no statute for this. There is no clause in any guild book for what a magistrate does when the hungry simply decline to go on being his soldiers. He had ridden in with a column and had now almost nothing. I should have felt standing there, like a man who had won. 12 fairies at my back, a column dissolving into my supper line, the bright thief at my shoulder. A man is allowed to feel like he has won. What I felt instead was something quieter and older than that. Xiao bumped my arm, the way she does when she decides I am drifting off somewhere. I was not drifting. I was only, for one breath, letting myself stand in the middle of the thing we had all built, before anything could be done to take it away. Because Kala was not finished. A man who has lost every reasonable move does not always stop playing. Sometimes he reaches past reason entirely. I saw his eyes leave the table and the fairies and travel up, instead, to the heart tree burning gold behind us. He reached into his coat and drew out a torch, already lit, the kind they carry to burn out nests. He looked at the heart tree, brighter now than it had been in 20 years. And then he looked back at me, and the last warmth left his face for good. If the asset cannot be collected, he said, then there is no asset and there is no dispute. The voice had gone flat and final. If it is not the guild's, then it belongs to no one. That was the last reasonable sentence he had left in him, and he threw the torch into the heart tree. He did not charge my fairies or my line. He simply set fire to the one thing the whole forest grows from. Because if he could not own it, he had decided that no one alive would get to keep it. The dry, 20-year sickness in that old wood took the flame at once. Fire ran up the trunk faster than the light had climbed it at dawn, and the gold I had coaxed back into the heart tree turned, in a matter of seconds, into something else entirely. This was not his strength, and I need to be as clear about that as I was about the collar. A man with real power does not burn the thing he came to seize. This was a beaten player kicking over the board because he could not win the game on it. But knowing it was despair did nothing to put the fire out. The heart tree, the thing the whole recipe was meant to save, the source of every fairy in that half circle, was burning in front of all of us, and it was burning fast. Everything I had built across the entire season stood lit up orange in the heat of it. Every bowl, every gray morning of digging, every fairy fed back from nothing. The full moon had risen. The timer I had counted down to for weeks was not coming. It was here, and it was on fire. For one breath I stood and watched the heart tree burn. And the old part of me, the part that always finds the worst number in the room, did the math. Ordinary water would not touch a fire that size. There was no putting this out the normal way. Then the cook in me caught up with the man, the way it always does, and saw the fire as a different thing. Not the end of the recipe, the stove for it. The last dish had to be cooked on the hottest flame in the forest, and Kala had just lit one. In a kitchen, the first rule is that you work with what is actually on the bench, not with what you wish were there instead. What stood in front of me was a burning heart tree, a finished recipe, and no time at all. So that is what we would work with. I had the pot. I had the recipe in my own hand. I had every ingredient we had grown and gathered and bartered for across a whole season. The only thing the dish still needed was heat enough to wake 20 dead years in one night, and there it was, climbing the trunk. Save the tree by cooking in the tree's own fire. It was either the most natural thing I had ever done in my life, or the last mistake I would ever make. From where I stood, gripping that burned page, the two of them looked exactly alike. So I picked up my pot and the recipe and started toward the flames, toward the trunk, into the heat, alone. The way I had done every hard thing since the morning they left me face down in the frost. Just as the last man with my hands had done. I did not get 3 steps. A hand closed on my sleeve and hauled me back, small and strong and entirely unwilling to let go. Zhao had my arm in both fists with her feet planted, and she was not arguing the point. She was simply not allowing it to happen. A cook does not work without a crew. The voice was Turn's. Of all the voices in that forest, the old fairy who spent a whole month calling my pot a trap was suddenly at my side, scowling, telling me I did not get to walk into a fire by myself. May arrived swearing. She had a vocabulary for moments like this that an elder of her years had no business owning, and she spent every word of it on me, on my arrogance, on the exact stupidity of a provider who thought he had to burn alone to be worth keeping. And she was right, in the way that lands like a slap. I had been one step from the last old mistake left in me. Walk in alone, give everything, be the man who saves them all and is gone before the part where they get to say thank you. I had very nearly done it again. It was the same mistake the last provider made, the one that left a charred clearing, and a collar, and a name no one in this forest would say out loud. He gave alone until there was nothing left of him to give. Xiao had a fistful of my sleeve telling me I did not have to. Turn was giving me orders. I was obeying Turn. In any ordinary season, that sentence would have meant the end of the world had finally arrived. Instead, it meant the reverse. For the first time all year, the old guardian was not commanding the fairies. He was commanding me. Stop trying to do the brave thing by yourself, he said, and ground his teeth on the next part. Because kindness costs him something physical. You fed this whole forest. Now let the forest feed you back. Then he turned to the half-circle of fairies and told them to give. And they gave. Lin came first off Turn's word, cupped her small hands, and from them poured a thin thread of the very light I had spent a whole season putting back into her. Restored strength, handed over freely, the first repayment on a debt I had never meant to collect. Then the rest of the half-circle, one after another. 12 fairies in full power, each pouring back a measure of the strength I had fed into them across the season, into the pot, into the work, into me. They had it to give for one reason only. I had given it to them first. This was the whole thing, at last, in a single motion. Every bowl I had cooked since that morning in the frost. Every gray dawn of digging, every fairy coaxed up from nothing, every mouthful handed across the fire. All of it came rushing back to me in one night. Vesper added what an old fairy could safely spare, and then a little more than that. Pei, who had once trampled my very first sprouts into the mud, gave without being asked twice. Corvin, who had walked out of the fog to map us for the guild, put his steady hand in beside hers. Xiao gave first and she gave most. She always reaches the table before I have finished setting it, and she reached this one the same way, both hands open, pouring back more than was safe, because holding anything back was never a skill she had bothered to learn where I was concerned. They give back exactly what I gave them, around and around in a circle, and I have never once been able to decide whether that is economics or family. In my experience, the two of them turn out, more often than not, to be the same thing wearing different aprons. So I cooked in the fire, hands in the heat, the burned page in front of me, the strength of every soul I had ever fed running up my arms and into the pot. I was not holding this dish up alone. The whole forest had its hands under it, right there with mine. Xiao kept her grip on my shoulder the entire time, standing in the heat beside me, close enough that the fire put a shine on her face. She would not be pulled back from it, and after a moment, I understood she was not only holding on, she was answering something old. He burned alone, she said, and her voice came steady in a way I had almost never heard from her. The last one. They put a collar on him, and they made sure he was alone, and that is the part that actually killed him. Not the giving, the alone. You burn with us, she said. That is the reason you are not going to die in this the way he did. She had it exactly, the thing I had been circling all season and never once said plainly. The collar did not kill the last provider by draining his strength out of him. It killed him by taking everyone else away first. A man can pour himself out for a whole forest and live through it, so long as the forest is pouring back into him. What finished the last one was the silence. The hands that should have been under his pot and were not there. I had spent my whole life, this one and the one before it, certain that to feed people was to end up empty and thrown away once the meal was done. Xiao, with her hand in the fire beside mine, had just handed me the cure for it. Do not do it alone. I was not alone. And somewhere in the heat, with 12 fairies pouring strength up my arms, and one stubborn thief refusing to let go of my shoulder, the dish finally came together. The last line of a dead man's recipe, written at last by the table he never got to have. It was ready. I turned to the burning trunk, and I fed it. Not water, not a fight, just the dish, ladled straight against the black and burning wood, the way you spoon broth to someone too weak to lift the cup on their own. The fire took the first of it and hissed. Then the flames began to fall, not blown out, fed full, the way a screaming child goes quiet the very moment the bowl reaches him. The fire sank down the trunk, guttered, and went out, and for a moment, the heart tree stood there black and silent and dead. And then, up out of the char, color. A thread of green pushed through the burned bark, and another, and the gray that had been creeping over that tree for 20 years began to run backward before our eyes, faster than anything that slow has any right to move. It did not stop at the tree. The green ran out along the roots and down into the ground and across the whole starving forest at once. And the canopy that had stood bare for 2 decades came back in a rush of new leaf, like a held breath finally let go. The burned clearing where the last provider died went green first of all. The charred circle that had sat dead and accusing at the edge of my farm closed over with new growth before any other patch of ground did. 20 years of death rolled back in under a minute. I thought of the first bowl I ever cooked in this place, the one I bet my whole survival on, handed to a fairy who would not even look at me. One bowl. That is where all of this started, and I stood now in a whole forest coming back to life around that one small bowl's echo. The city stood in the new green and could not speak. May was weeping openly and not bothering to hide it this time. They had buried the idea of this forest ever living again a long time ago. It was standing up around them in leaf, and not one of them had a word ready for it. And in the middle of all that new green stood Kala, a dead torch still in his hand, planted in front of the one thing he had ridden all this way to declare dead and gone. His own soldiers were sitting at my fairy table, spears down, bowls up, watching a forest they had been told was a spent resource, put out 20 years of leaves in a single morning. There was no report left that he can write which would survive what these men had just watched happen. The guild's entire claim rested on one word: exhausted. The fairies were an exhausted resource, dwindling, in need of careful guild management, which is the polite term they use for milking a thing until it finally dies. He had built a whole career on that single word, and there they were, 12 fairies in full strength, in a forest roaring back into life, fed not by management, but by one cook with one pot. Every word of his case stood there now in leaf and wing, calling him a liar without troubling to say anything at all. He came here to declare the forest dead. The forest had read his paperwork and disagreed, loudly, in green. I am told magistrates do not lose very often. I do not think this is the kind of losing that comes with a clause for appeal. He opened his mouth. Then he looked at his own men eating at my table, and at the fairies, and at the new leaves still unrolling overhead, and whatever he had meant to say did not come out. And into that silence, Corvin stepped forward. "You would betray the guild," Kala said, his voice finally cracking up out of its calm at last. "For a bowl of soup?" He rounded on his soldiers, on the fairies, on all of us. He wanted an argument. He wanted someone to shout back so that he could be the reasonable man in the clearing again. No one answered him. That was the whole of it. Not one soul in that clearing gave him a single word to push against. The fairies looked at him. His soldiers looked down at their bowls. The silence did more damage to the man than any speech anyone could have made. His power had always run on hunger, on the certainty that a starving thing must sooner or later do what he tells it. He had lost the hungry. Standing there before a fed forest, with nothing left in the world to starve, the magistrate had simply run out of grip on it. One by one, the hunters of his own column set down their spears and picked up bowls instead, and that was their answer to him, given with their hands, because not one of them troubled with words either. Then Corvin said it, clear enough for the whole forest to hear. "In the name of the hunters who are tired of starving," he said, "Magistrate Kala, you are under arrest." He had carried this man's orders his entire career. He ended them in a single sentence. He shouted in the end. Finally, after a whole season of that maddening, gloved, even-tempered calm, the magistrate actually raised his voice, and I will admit, I was a little disappointed I had to wait until the very last minute to hear it. Still, good timing in its way. They took him without a struggle. There was nothing left to struggle against. The collar he had carried in for Shao went into a sack along with his torch and his papers, and the man who had haunted this forest for 20 years was walked out of it under his own men's hands. And then it was quiet, and it was over, and I made myself turn around to look at what was standing behind me. I had spent my whole life afraid to do exactly that. You feed people, you turn around, and they are gone. That was the one law I had always been sure of. They were all still there, every single one of them. The fairies, the elders, the soldiers who were turning into neighbors as I watched, the children, May still wiping her face, Turn pretending he was not. I had fed them, and I had turned around, and no one had left. Xiao slipped her hand into mine without a word, the same way she had taken the bowl instead of the collar, the same way she had refused to let go of my shoulder in the fire. The thief who trusted nothing alive had decided, a long time ago now, to trust me. She had stayed. Something in me that had been torn open since long before I ever fell into this world finally closed over, just as the burned clearing had. The wound was feed them and be discarded, and I had carried it my whole life, and there in the new green, with her hand in mine, it healed. I almost missed them, in the middle of all that. Out at the far edge of the living forest, where the green ran up against the country beyond, there were figures standing in the tree line. There were no cloaks among them, no column, no collars waiting in anyone's hand. Other fairies, thin and watching. And among them people, ordinary people, the kind who guide and carry rather than the kind who hunt. They had come from somewhere else, some other dying forest, and they were looking at our green canopy the way starving men look at a lit window at night. I understood what they were before anyone said it aloud. The word had already gone out past these trees, as the smell of a good pot always travels furthest. The provider has come back. They were not the last people I would feed. They were only the first of all the ones still coming. It is the 99th day since they left me in a ditch to die, and I spent the morning of it counting bowls. That is the whole arc of the thing, if you want it in one sentence. Frost and a death sentence to a full pot and a long line in 99 days. They tell me I hold A rank now. The guild records a provider by the strength of the fairies he keeps, and 12 fairies in full power does not leave them much room to argue. The worst hunter in the world is rated, on their own paper, among the very best of them. It does not feel like a rank. It feels like a cook with a great many hungry mouths and just enough broth to go around them all. If you are the kind who keeps a ledger, that is the best rank there has ever been, and I would not trade it for any letter in their book. F rank to A rank by way of soup. I have decided that is either a genuine success story or a very specific and useless athletic record. On the better mornings, I cannot tell the two apart, and on the better mornings, it does not particularly matter which one it is. Stand where I stood on the first day, and look at it now. Then it was gray snow and a worthless brand and a body in a ditch. Now it is a walled farm in a city gone green, a heart tree in full leaf above it, and a line at my pot that forms before the light does. And the count, if you want the count. One bowl, handed to one starving thief who would not look at me. Then 12 fairies on their feet in full strength. Then a whole forest back in leaf, and now a line at dawn, with old guild hunters standing patiently in it. The same hunters, who once stepped over my body in the frost, now wait their turn for a bowl like everyone else. I do not make a thing of it. I fill the bowl, and I hand it over. A full man is a calm man, and I have had more than enough of the other kind for one life. Vesper found me at the pot on the 99th morning, the elder who started all of this with a deadline. He had set me a wager in my first week here: feed the city by the full moon or get out. He had come to settle it in front of everyone, as publicly as he had said it. A deadline to the full moon, he said to the gathered line, loud, the way he does everything now that he has decided to be heard. I gave this man until the full moon to feed a city. He looked slowly around at all the green. He did not feed a city, he fed a forest. The wager is finished, he said, and then he did not finish it as I expected. He did not say that I had won it. He said stay for good, not as a man on probation, not as a stranger we are still testing. Stay as one of ours. The whole line heard him say it. The elder who opened my entire story with an ultimatum had just closed it with an invitation. 20 years of guarding this city by keeping it small and quiet and unnoticed, and he ended all of it by asking the outsider to stay for good. The circle ran clean back to its start. First, the man told me I had until the full moon, I thought. Now, he is telling me forever. By my rough reckoning, that is something on the order of 400 times longer than the original offer. I do not think I have ever accepted a worse deal quite so quickly. I told him yes. There was no speech in it anywhere. I had been home for a while already, without bothering to name it. The way you sometimes are. Vesper put his thin hand on my shoulder, and that was the wager settled, and neither of us said one more word about who had won. The farm runs itself now, mostly, which is to say that other people run it and tell me how it went afterward. Turn took the planning. The old guardian who spent a month certain my pot was a trap is the most careful head of seed and soil that any farm could ask for. His old survival paranoia, the very thing that made him fight me, turns out to make superb farm discipline. He grumbles at everyone about frost dates and drainage and proper spacing, and he feeds every one of them while he does it, and the beds have never once been straighter. Pei teaches the fairy children how to plant. The saboteur who once trampled my first sprouts into the mud now kneels in the rows, showing small hands how to set a seed without crushing it. People change, in my experience, a good deal faster than anyone ever gives them credit for. Corvin leads a new wing of the hunters. The Fed Wing, the city has taken to calling it, the ones who walked out of Kala's column and stayed on for the soup. He told me once that to the guild, this place was a farm and they feared it. Now he runs the part that learned why. And the guild itself, what is left of it without its monopoly on hunger, sent a letter, a formal one, sealed and very polite. It asked in careful language whether the provider might consider teaching its hunters how to feed a forest rather than how to bleed one dry. The institution that built its whole power on milking the weak had just written to the poacher to ask him for lessons. I read it through twice to enjoy it properly. I could have refused them. I did think about it. But a hungry man only turns angry again, and I am tired of angry men. So I said yes to that one as well. I will teach the guild to feed. It is either the most foolish thing I have ever agreed to, or the only ending that truly closes the wound, and I have lost the ability to tell those apart, which by now I have decided to take as a good sign. The figures at the tree line turned out to be the first of a great many. They came in over the following days, delegations from other fairy cities, thin and wary, drawn the whole way here by the rumor of a forest that came back. May took one look at them and began complaining at once. "Now we will have to teach a whole crowd of you to salt a soup properly," she said, as if this were the worst news the new green had brought us. The old knowledge of the fairies does not pass itself along on its own. Someone has to sit down and teach it, and apparently that someone is us. From May, complaint is the warmest language she owns. When she grumbles at you about your salt, it means she has decided you are worth the trouble of correcting. She had clearly decided the whole arriving world was worth correcting, which from May is something very close to open joy. And anyway, she added, glaring down the line of delegates, every last one of you has problems with salt. I did not argue the point. I have learned the hard way not to argue with May about salt. She remembers when this whole forest knew how, and she means to make it know how again. What the delegates told us, between bowls, was the true size of the thing. Mine was not the only dying forest. It was only the first one to come back. There were gray forests all the way out to the edge of the maps, full of fairies waiting for someone to remember how to feed them. I had thought, on that first day, that I had fallen into a small story. One ditch, one city, one pot. It turns out I fell into a very large one with a small beginning, which is how most stories worth the telling tend to start. That night we ate together, all of us, at the long table under the heart tree, the way we have every night since the fire. The family I cooked into being out of a dying city and one sack of flour, plus a forest of new mouths, plus whoever had wandered in hungry that day. I turned from the pot and found half my prepared greens gone from the board, and Zhao 3 paces off with both cheeks packed full, staring up at the tree as though it had just that moment become the single most fascinating thing in the entire green forest. "It is not me," she said, the words muffled around a mouthful she had very obviously just stolen. I looked at her. She looked at the tree. A single new leaf drifted down between us. Neither of us said one word about the green smear left on her chin. The first time she did that, we were both starving, and she did it to live. She does it now in a city full of food, for no reason on earth except that it is hers, and I am hers, and that is exactly how she says so. I saw all of that, I told her. Every last bit of it. She chewed, entirely unbothered, and reached for another root the moment she judged I had looked away. It was not survival anymore. It was only home, wearing the same face survival used to wear, and that is the whole of the victory. I laughed. I do that easily now, which is not a thing the man in the ditch would ever have recognized in himself. The whole table laughed along with me, and the thief grinned around her stolen greens, and the heart tree let another leaf fall into the soup, and nobody minded at all. Here is the whole of it, the way I would tell it to the man face down in the frost, if I could only reach him. You came into this world an enemy with a spear, and you fainted, and you cooked exactly one bowl of soup. And in the end, a whole world sat down at your table. They branded me the weakest hunter alive on my first morning here. F rank, worthless. They stepped over my body and kept on walking, and I fed them. Every last one of them, the fairies and the elders and the deserters and the hunters who once left me to die in the cold. That is the only power I was ever handed in this place. Not a blade, not a spell, not some hidden bloodline waking up at the right dramatic moment. A pot, a knife, salt, fire, and the plain stubborn refusal to stop feeding people who could not yet pay me back for any of it. If you are out there somewhere, weak and counted out, and sure that it means you are nothing, I would tell you the one thing this forest taught me. The whole world runs on hunger, and the one who feeds it patiently, without ever keeping a tally, is the one who in the end holds all of it. From up above the trees, on the 99th night, you would see a whole forest burning green where it had stood gray for 20 years, a long table lit beneath it, and a line at a cook's pot that has not ended yet and, I rather suspect, never entirely will. And far out past the green, at the very edge of where the eye can still carry, there is another forest standing gray. One more dying patch of the world, waiting for someone to remember how to feed it. I have a pot. I know the way there now. We will reach it. We always do.
This story has value because it shows strength from a completely different angle. The hero is not powerful because he swings a sword, wins duels, or scares people into obeying him. He is powerful because he feeds the abandoned, notices what everyone else ignores, and keeps showing up even when the whole world calls him useless. Every bowl he cooks becomes more than food. It becomes trust, healing, protection, and finally a way for an entire forest to stand together. The lesson is simple. Being weak in the wrong system does not mean you are worthless. Sometimes your real gift looks ordinary until it reaches the people who need it most. He saves the fairies because he stops trying to prove himself to the hunters and starts building a table where no one has to be hungry, owned, or thrown away again. So take this from the story. Do not underestimate the quiet skill that keeps people alive. A blade can win a fight, but a person who knows how to feed, organize, and care can bring a whole world back to life. Subscribe and leave a like if you want more stories where the weakest person in the room becomes the reason everyone survives.